네, 안녕하세요. 아트선재센터 연구 모임에 오신 모든 분들을 환영합니다. 또한 온라인으로 참여하고 계신 관람객들 분들도 환영합니다. 아트선재센터 연구 프로그램은 동시대 시각예술 현장에서 대두된 현상과 질문들에 주목하고 이와 관련해 깊이 있는 논의와 토론의 장을 마련하기 위해 기획되었습니다. 2023년 연구는 기술융합 예술의 공공성에 대한 새로운 담론 형성에 기여하고 디지털 시대의 새로운 커뮤니티 아트를 상상하는 데 기여하고자 합니다. 이를 위해 우리는 마이클 주와 데닐 크로브루치의 NFT 예술 프로젝트 OGCR Organic Growth Crystal Reef 유기적으로 성장하는 크리스털 산호 프로젝트에 주목했습니다. 지금 여러분이 그 화면에서 보시는 이 산호초가 AR로 지금 저희가 플레이하고 있는 상황입니다. OGCR은 블랙체인 거래가 발생될 때마다 특수하게 제작된 알고리즘에 의해 3D 산호초가 변화하고 증가하게 프로그램되어 있습니다. 결과적으로 6,955개의 지갑이 참여하였고 이로 인해 6,955개의 지갑이 공동 창작한 디지털 스케이프가 생성되었던 것입니다. 우리는 이 프로젝트를 만나면서 투기의 대상으로 폄하되는 NFT 기술에 펼쳐지지 못한 가능성에 대해 주목하게 되었고 블록체인 기술을 통해 새로운 커뮤니티 아트를 제안하였던 OGCR에 관심을 가지게 되었습니다. 오늘 우리는 OGCR에 대해 탐구하며 다음과 같은 질문을 던지고자 합니다. 블록체인과 같은 탈중앙화 기술로 인해 생성되는 커뮤니티는 어떤 새로운 형태의 예술을 창조할 수 있을까요? 동시대 예술은 블록체인 기술이 야기하는 사회적, 정치적, 경제적 구조에 대해 어떤 비평을 생산해낼 수 있는 것일까요? 또한 이번 모임의 핵심에는 예술가 마이클 주와 하와이에 기반한 메가랩 사이의 혁신적인 협력이 있습니다. 이 파트너십은 OGCR로 만들어진 버추얼 산호초를 지금 여기 앞에 지금 전시되고 있는 이 화면이 이 메가랩과의 마이클 주와의 협력의 하나의 샘플로서 저희가 지금 디스플레이를 해놨습니다. 이 협력은 버추얼 산호초를 물리적인 바다에 이식하여 실제 해양에서 해양 환경에 미치는 영향을 관찰하는 것을 포함합니다. 이 협업은 예술과 과학 간의 다학제적 노력이 창출하는 새로운 연구 분야의 가능성에 대해 생각하게 합니다. 우리는 해양 생태학, 데이터 과학 등을 주력으로 하는 메가랩의 목표와 마이클 주의 예술적 비전 사이에서 발생하는 시너지 효과에 대해서 논의하고 서로 다른 커뮤니티가 어떻게 서로로부터 배울 수 있는지 살펴보고자 합니다. 이를 통해 우리는 기존 경계를 넘어 지식 생산을 촉발하는 피드백 시스템의 가능성에 대해 알아보고자 하는 것입니다. 우선 우리는 마이클 주 선생님을 무대로 초대해서 OGCR에 대해서 소개받는 시간을 갖고자 합니다. 마이클 주는 조각가이며 멀티 예술가로서 뉴욕에 기반하고 있습니다. 그의 작품은 위트니 뮤지엄, 베니스 비엔날레 등 세계적인 기관과 행사에 전시되었으며 구겐하임 미술관, 라크마, 모더나 뮤제, 엠플러스 등에 소장되어 있습니다. 최근에는 홍콩의 K11 아트 파운데이션과 호놀룰루 2022 하와이 트리날레 그리고 덴버 미술관에서 소개되었습니다. 마이클 주의 작업은 언제나 경계와 사회 공간을 중심으로 발전했습니다. 이번 OGCR 작업도 접근 불가능한 변형의 공간인 사이버 세계와 깊은 바다에 사는 생명들 사이를 오가며 확대되었습니다. 마이클 주 선생님의 프로젝트 소개 이후 마이클 주와 이 프로젝트의 핵심적 역할로서 파트너셨던 데닐 크리보루치 사이에 미리 녹화된 대담이 상영될 예정입니다. 데닐 크리보루치는 뉴욕에 기반한 디지털 아티스트로 이번 OGCR 프로젝트의 프로그래밍 전반을 담당하셨습니다. 그럼 우선 마이클 주 선생님을 무대로 초대하겠습니다.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here in person, and also to our large online audience. I wanted to, first of all, especially thank the Arts Council of Korea for sponsoring our event here, and to Atrtsonjecen터, especially longtime supporter Sonje Kim, and my fantastic and positively enthusiastic curator, Hyunwoo. And I wanted to begin this sharing session and story about this project, Organic Growth Crystal Reef, which began ostensibly as an NFT project, but was meant to be much more. I mean, I think an NFT, by definition, is a digital token for a real-world asset. And with that kind of basic introduction, I thought I would start by sharing a little bit of where I come from as a sculptor, because primarily I think I'm considered a sculptor, an artist who works in material, but who also works with how ideas shape material. And in many ways, let me just run through a couple of small examples to give some context to where OGCR has come from and may continue to kind of relate. For a long time, many years, I've worked with projects that have essentially a kind of decentral nature, where the single object isn't really where all the meaning comes from, rather the kind of collective of objects form the meaning around what the piece might be about. 108 polycarbonate police riot shields holding up a mobile of plasticine objects, or 64 Nerf cast Buddhas with modeled in terracotta and foam, suspending 108 years of toy manufacturing heads from America. Oftentimes, work of mine involves transformation into crystalline forms, urine basically evaporating over the course of the exhibition, turning into crystalline, waiting for elk to lick salt off of my body in Gangwon-do province, passing the crystallized substance of my sweat dried into their own bloodstreams, or artificially growing like 100,000 years of crystalline growth synthetically onto a noose. Participatory projects also involving the audience in many ways, creating the work collectively, in this case a figure on a super refrigerated base called God 2, in which every viewer whose breath and presence contributes some of the ambient humidity, contributes ice crystal that will grow and eventually, over the course of the exhibition, completely obscure the sculpture. More transformative works, a speaker cube made entirely out of frozen sawdust that over the course of the exhibition evaporates, melts, and becomes, again, a completely different form. The transformation of air from my lungs into crystalline glass form in this case. Other kinds of concerns of mine have been largely environmental, another issue that I'm very interested in. These are casts from crane legs, endangered crane legs that basically migrate and roost seasonally in the DMZ between North and South Korea. But every time these graphite legs are installed, they leave some of them behind. Trying to give voice, in this case, to coral collected at a former Japanese internment camp in Hawaii, given voice by use of bone conducting technology, basically tuning the coral to a certain frequency so that using technology it speaks. In addition to practicing as a sculptor and exhibiting, I also teach. I happen to teach at a couple of graduate school universities, Yale University and Columbia, among others. and which is a kind of invaluable exchange of ideas and an opportunity to kind of continue to be a part of an art world that you would like to be a part of yourself in many ways. And so a case in point is a number of grad students I met at Yale in 2015 who introduced me to the idea of something called blockchain and cryptocurrency. And in 2015, I met a number of grad students that were dealing in something called Bitcoin. And aside from making a lot of money, I watched over the course of 2 years their ideas change. I really watched them go from making objects with central cores that had meaning to shifting practices that were involving systems and joining systems together to make much more complex, contextually driven work. And that really stuck with me, the influence of that thinking. But myself and for what I was working on, I didn't really have an idea of how I might interface with it. But again, it was something that I followed and began to kind of continue to be interested in. If I cut ahead to 2019, I met a platform, digital production platform called snark.art. And at the time, I'd already worked with their curator on other projects, ironically enough, in Murano on glass. And she said, you have to meet this production company because I think some of the concepts of your ideas that you've been talking to me about within the digital arena might be appealing to them. So we met and I talked to them about the idea of a project that could grow, a project that would change every time that it was looked at, because a lot of times works like this are not so favorable in a gallery. Works that disintegrate, works that change, works that grow are kind of antithetical to the idea of something that is stable. And so after introducing that idea of something that would grow and be based in something blockchain related, because as a sculptor, the idea of reality really became a philosophical question. The idea of material, someone who works in material, the concept in blockchain of verification that number of different people all over the world or transactionally have to verify that something actually happened is almost a philosophical question of reality, right, of materiality. So that in a way is a kind of private kind of interest never left me as well. So in introducing this idea in the late 2019, suddenly COVID hit. And over the course of COVID, I continued to gestate this idea and develop it a little bit more. And I think during that period was able to meet and be introduced by Snark to artist Danil Krivoruchko, who again was an artist who had a significant, I think, portfolio of data visualization and motion graphics. I was a big fan of his works and some of his kind of animated work. And in being introduced to Danil, who also had, released a collection of what were then introduced to me as NFTs. It's the first I'd ever heard the term. Had a certain kind of savvy and knowledge in communicating between physical art and digital art. And so Danil and I, over a series of coffees over months and months during COVID, began to develop and see if we could take this idea that I had about something that would grow almost organically and into a digital arena and introduce it as an NFT collection. And I was very kind of wary about the idea of an NFT collection as an artist because it leans so heavily into the transactional. And in many ways, many people saw it and its reputation was purely as a kind of financial instrument, right? That the digital token did not really stand for anything except for another type of currency, another type of thing to be exchanged. So I thought if I wanted to take this on, it'd really have to take on the idea of the transactional as a medium. The transaction itself would almost have to be clay, would almost have to be like a malleable material. Every time it was addressed, it would have to change, right? Or it'd have to be something that would take form. So with that in mind, Danil and I started to exchange briefs on how we might do that algorithmically. So it really, as visual artists, both of us, me from a more material, him from a more image position, started to exchange images. So I have a long-standing, interest, obviously, in crystalline forms and transformation. Started to share him images like this, works of mine from the past, as well as some of my science background in crystal and crystallography. One of the other things that I was really fascinated by as I kind of, explored the digital and online community that was connected to blockchain was the idea of community, which is something also community and collective and collaboration, something that's a strong kind of interest in my work. And one of the other kind of, I think, key points was the kind of connection of crystals and crystalline form to the very basis of, I think, the ultimate ecosystem in many ways, the ultimate kind of architecture, natural architecture, which is coral reefs. And coral reefs, the exoskeletons are based upon calcite crystals. So marrying the idea of the calcite crystal and sharing this as a kind of basic form with Danil, he started to come up with his own version of how we might interpret crystals. So I asked him to take a crash course in crystallography, and he began to learn how crystals form at a really molecular and structural level incredibly quickly. I think in the course of a couple months, he learned what I learned. It took me years to learn. And we began to make these storyboards and visual boards to just kind of start to develop how these things might take form. And after several months, we arrived at this, series of algorithms that would basically take the participant or the buyer of the crystal of the NFT's crypto wallet data, their unique number, which is I think 11-digit number, and marry it to include the wallet ether balance, detect what was in their wallet, NFT amounts, the blockchain, time on the blockchain, basically everything that would indicate that moment a human being would interface with the blockchain became a genetic code of sorts that would tie into all of these different ways that crystals form, and that it would form in many ways a unique form entirely based upon this one moment and that unique individual's participation in the project. But in order to kind of continue to keep that from being unfixed and to make that, I guess, in a way, try to avoid its being locked into something that was tradable, we had it grow again every time it was sold. So every time it was sold, it would change to really kind of upset the ability for this to become to establish a scarcity or rarity or anything like that. So basically, it was like Pokemon cards on some kind of steroids. It would just change all the time. There was no way to fix like that one Pokemon would be established as the kind of main kind of character. Some of the forms that were generated. And after 3 months, the form was locked and became a fixed NFT. But one of the other things that was really important to me is the idea throughout the project that there are a number of outcomes, that this project would grow horizontally as opposed to vertically. And one of the things that was important was its kind of comparison to me in many ways of like the way that even mushrooms grow, a kind of mycorrhizal horizontal system in which all of these networks that were invisible would connect and result in all of these forms that would kind of blossom and maybe become the artworks themselves, almost like mushrooms coming up in the forest. So one of the outcomes as we outlined them were all mapped as roadmaps. And one of the outcomes was to the creation of a DAO, and that was a decentralized autonomous organization When we released this in 2021, in October, all 10,301 of the forms sold in 4 hours. Following that 10,301 release, 30,000 more transactions took place and continued to change. So the numbers became very interesting, and the changing of form became very interesting, and it resulted in a community of owners that all collectively had a vote in owning this entire project. And what they would own ostensibly was a physical sculpture that was meant to be built from this, which is called the reef. And that reef is in progress now as almost a sculptural portrait of all 10,301 crystals that were created by this community. I wouldn't say as necessarily as co-collaborators, but as participants and as parts of this project that are really essential and vital to creating it. And along the way, one of the things that's also really important was its kind of connection back to traditional art. And so one of the things of many kind of different ways we tried to play with the variation was to pass this among other artists who also had NFTs projects that were in different kinds of levels. So we had Danil come and pass his wallet to me. Here's one to Glenn Kino. Nicholas Gallinen is a musician and artist. Sarah Mayo-Haas, another kind of great early adopter and practitioner and identifier of Bitcoin artwork. And Tom Sachs, who I think you're all familiar with from recent shows here at Sonje. And on to even Krista Kim, who is much more kind of crypto-native artist. Other things that we found with the community were kind of identifying the kind of variety and numbers of our community across the globe. Some of the things that we worked on also were transparency, sharing all of the technology. Another thing that was important to us, Daniel would conduct regular kinds of tutorials on showing and sharing the algorithms so that other people could use this technology. The creation of a AR platform in which viewers were able to, again, anyone in the public could access any of the 10,301 crystals and begin to make and do what they'd like with them. Interesting to me was the different ways that people were using these assets in gaming, exploring it with Real Engine, different kinds of ways to start to apply these things that were beyond our control, which is also interesting to me and important, that they would take the artwork, take any kind of aspect of it, and make it would be publicly available. Again, the idea of authorship, another good question and interesting to me was people could take these, and the idea of ownership and the idea of value, which were super important. So people were making these in the metaverse, forming their own galleries, showing them, perhaps trading them, but ostensibly just showing and creating and interacting with whatever forms they wanted to. The next stage and other stage that relates to that kind of horizontal platforming was how would this project kind of interface with the traditional art world? So I had an opportunity to go to a conference of NFT NYC, accompanied by Melissa Chu, the director of the Hirshhorn, and Marina Isgro, the curator of media. And so we did a talk about the idea of the traditional art world actually kind of having a long history of dealing with conceptually based work and how it's not so different in many ways. And that was just an introduction to the idea of mainstream art meeting NFTs. And that was back in 2000 and again, December of 2021, the month after we launched it. This is like an example of the hype that was going on. We came on after Quentin Tarantino. And it was a really interesting kind of opportunity because I don't think in many ways we were introducing a generative art project that would change an NFT, and it was relatively new, I think, at the time. Other ways that this work then, aside from the sculpture, were beginning to kind of take place outside of the digital space were the next factor, which we're pursuing right now, and we're happening kind of concurrently. Interactive kind of digital uses, things that we're exploring now. And the development of, again, sharing some of the ways in which we're learning to begin to print and examine how to print 10,301 of these forms to form a reef structure and a sculpture that will essentially, grow to encompass form and place at the same time. In many ways, this is a portrait, again, of all of that activity and an outcome that is sculptural and has a physical entity that you can encounter. I mean, one of the things I think that's really fascinating to me about artwork is that when you see physical artwork, which of course I'm a strong believer in, and in the kind of texture and the encounter, because I think when you see an artwork, you have to contend with two things, right? You have to contend with both its materiality and its presence, but you also often, whether there's an idea that's direct or an idea that's indirect behind it, you kind of come up against that authorship as well. And that's a very impactful encounter, I think, of real work that can't be simulated in other ways. But one thing I found that was really intriguing about the digital kind of community was that in this NFT and digital space, you were encountering communities that were forming around an idea that may never, ever become anything. They may never become physical. They may be initiated. They may become a project. But the NFT idea itself was almost like a campfire that this community would gather around and form a belief. So they would almost become a culture. The opposite end is, in many ways, something you can encounter, but how can we bring them both together? And so I was really interested in how the sculpture would not be the end of the project. And I think so some of the other things that we started to spread out into from the beginning, before we even released it, was an interest in making sure that the origin and the concepts of the piece directly touched upon some of its interests that it relied upon. And one of them was obviously environmental concerns involving reef conservation and reef preservation. So I worked with a number of labs early on in the project to create a kind of philanthropic end to this. Since it was going to be a transactional kind of project, we decided to direct a large proportion of the percentage of the royalties back into coral reef research. So we ended up funding a number of labs, and in the course of some of our interaction with different labs, we were able to, as a community of 10,000, name a new species. So this is a species that actually is in the scientific record named by our community. We helped to fund different kinds of laboratories that work with data visualization. And this is all from photogrammetric research. This is all from photos taken underwater and reconstructions that examine reef vitality. Some amazing stuff. And along the way, I met an especially important group of scientists that form a collective called the Mega Lab, based out of Hilo, Hawaii. And this group, the Mega Lab, led by ostensibly by John Burns, but including this is Kylie Pascoe, Cliff Capono, Malohia Kinamaka, ostensibly Hanani Kane, John Spencer, some of the primary members of the lab, Alex Spengler. These are a group of scientists who, on the side of their science work, also form this collective that is researching and documenting and working on coral reef and marine biological conservation. Cliff Capono is one of the best surfers in the world, but who also is an incredible molecular biologist. And John Burns is data scientist who created a lot of the proprietary kind of data visualization technology and techniques that allow us to kind of visualize reefs and make visual and virtual reconstructions. So as I met these guys, John said, well, we're not really in need of funding right now, but bring us your ideas. Let's continue a conversation. And as I started to print and began to make these sculptures and bring them to him and show them, he responded very quickly to the idea that the forms themselves were based upon calcite crystals, which were, again, part of the fundamental part of the coral reef kind of identity and the coral reef makeup. So he thought this was a great opportunity to use those forms to study the uptake and recruitment preferentially and over time of different types of corals and other kinds of marine growth. So we began an experiment of beginning to sink and place these corals, these crystals of ours, into a sanctioned site off of the Kona coast, which we've now been doing for the last, I guess, 1.5 years. And as we've been researching and studying these forms, we've been seeing different types of uptake and recruitment. And what I want to do, and what John wants to do, is for us to continue to do a really slow uptake and a responsible examination of whether or not we're doing more harm than good in the purposes of kind of creating a much longer running project. In the process, now that the algorithmic growth of this crystal has stopped, what we find in making virtual models is the opportunity to have a digital virtual model that is almost growing organically now. So it's kind of a great dream, I think, of mine on the long-range project is, can we make this new organically growing, if we document it every 3 weeks or every month, that changes with nature, into its own NFT? And can that NFT now fund the very research, fund Native Hawaiian research, fund the research that actually keeps it going and create a truly sustainable economic loop to justify the artwork, the research, and actually be almost independent? And I didn't want to get ahead of myself a little too much, but I just wanted to share a little bit about where the Mega Lab was coming from. I think in the second part today, we're going to talk a little more about that and share an interview that I did with John about it. But we won't have very many visuals, so I want to give you a little preview of that. But I think I'll leave this at this slide here for now, in saying that I'd like to share with you next a little bit of a chat I had with Danil to give you a little bit of background and introduce you to some of what was behind our collaboration together as a digital artist and a sculptor.
네, 마이클께서 예고해 주신 대로 이 프로젝트의 중요한 파트너 중 하나인 데닐과의 인터뷰 영상을 지금부터 한 20분간 플레이하도록 하겠습니다.
Can you tell me a little bit more about, when I was introduced to you by Snark and the team at Snark and Andy and Nadia, they said, you've got to meet this artist. There's no way we could do OGCR or do this project that, you're thinking of and that we're talking about without meeting Danil, and who has experience in, something that was new to me called generative art and kind of algorithmic use of algorithms to visualize things. But when they showed me your work, I responded immediately, of course, to the visual qualities, the pacing. I mean, everything I'd see is artistic about it and visual, but also, something struck a chord with me that it's like, really, you're visualizing data, and that's something close to me as well. But can you tell me more about, I guess, your own kind of history with generative art and what you think about it, the medium?
Okay. So I should start from the very beginning, probably, right? Because it started from my very, well, not very early age, but I had 2 degrees, and first was computer science. So I naturally was exposed to algorithmic way of doing things. But the funny thing, I spent like 6 years in this university, and all the time I did like my own approach to 3D graphics, because there wasn't much of like ready-made software back in these days.
Yeah.
So I had to like the first thing I like wrote as a programmer was actually like graphic editor for the Spectrum, like very like long time ago. But it's funny. So at some point I realized like all the time I do programming, I actually do 3D graphics. So probably there is a point for me to continue this role. So I got the 2nd degree as a graphic designer, and naturally after that, for very like I don't know 10 years maybe, it was just slow shift to embrace like what's the word for that, both sides, basically, because I started more like as a graphic designer, not using my computer science degree at all, and slowly moved to adapting the techniques I already knew into my process. And at some point I started with visual effects, and the whole like it's all clicked, because the software I've used at this point it was mixed. It like need for there is a need for you to know both sides, like to be a bit of a programmer, not like professional programmer, but understand what's going on under the hood, and an artist, like more like graphic kind of thing. So when I found this thing, it's like immediately clicked, and since then I was using this software, and it's called Houdini, and it's well, the backbone of generative art these days, because it allows you to design, well, not the like final piece, but to design the process of creating the piece. So you basically work on a verb, not on a noun. And yeah, so you design the process, and that's why it's called generative, because it takes something at the very beginning. So you design the like pipeline, what's going on with this initial data, and it should hopefully, in the best case, yeah, end up as being something interesting.
So fascinating. So in a way, that program, the idea, the very fact of how Houdini is designed, in a way created almost its own medium. It's almost,
well, yeah, it allows you to simplify a lot of things, because if you don't use it, there is different ways to do like generative art, being like 100% on programmer side, something like processing, or if you like familiar.
Can you break that down also for our audience? Just what generative art is really?
Yeah, well,
some people might not really know what
I
generative
don't
art is,
like have the Wikipedia great definition.
just to you. I mean,
yeah, but to me, it's any art piece that involves to some degree coding. So you have to do something in code, not necessarily like 100% as I do, because there is what Houdini gives to you. It's a mix. So you can use your familiar to use if you're a 3D artist, you can use a familiar approach, like for modern things, texture and lighting, like all the things are already made, but they are broken down to like simple bricks. So it's like a huge sandbox for an artist. So you're not limited to what was made for you by software. If you don't like the tool, you can just like explode it, like and change some pieces, or like create it completely from scratch. What fits to you better. So it allows you a lot of freedom, and as Spider-Man been told that there is a lot of responsibility, because you can overcomplicate things in so many ways, because it's really sandbox. So
it's also like almost like chromosomes in DNA, right? You can alter them,
I mean, you can combine and create like crazy complex things, and It's interesting, but it like in every project you are in this like blank canvas kind of state, because you have to start from something, and it generates a lot of anxiety, because like you can go the wrong way, and then like
You
down
can't
the
go
road.
backwards,
I
right?
mean, you can, but the time is wasted. So
Yeah,
it's usually like the very beginning. You have to do a lot of planning,
yeah,
like think about how you're gonna approach this. And I mean, you do that, and every single time it goes wrong anyway. So you have to, like for OG crystals, I rebuilt the whole scene, I think 3 or 4 times,
yeah,
like because it was a very new kind of
yeah.
project to me, because it's usually I'm from visual effects kind of background, so usually they don't want me to produce the system, right? They want one shot.
Right.
It should be flexible enough, because there is like a lot of feedback, so I use this procedural generative approach a lot, but they don't expect me to build something, pass it to, I don't know, to some other people, and they're going to use it for next decade,
Right.
just to generate new and new things. So over there in crystals, I had to build something like reliable.
Yes.
It should take any data, because I didn't know the data in advance, and generate something which you and the audience will like.
No,
And it's a, so I had to, like, I started, and after a few weeks I realized, well, I can do it better. Just kill the whole thing and start it over. And it was
so
like 3 or
interesting.
4 iterations like that.
So the project brief itself, in
Yeah.
a way, was kind of influencing
Mhm.
what's possible and
Yeah, for sure.
what
Well,
affected you. And but I mean, I'm dialing back for a second as well,
Mhm.
because I really responded to and relate to your working through one degree in computer science, and then it becoming clear that you needed to, in the process, incorporate, or did incorporate, a visual and graphic element, but then that you leaned way into that almost completely. Like when I went from science to art, the process was realizing to me that, you know, one aspect of art was absolutely already embedded in science, and then jumping really more and rejecting everything that was part of science, and it's slowly working its way back in. So there's
Yeah.
some, I don't know, some kind of sympathetic kind of, I guess, procedure or process and history of like my own practice that I think I could relate to in yours. And so I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit more about, like, you know, our collaborative process itself. I mean, we never really talked about it from outside, and I'm just
Yeah,
kind of
well,
curious. Like, we sat down, I know, at a number of coffee shops in the beginning when we first met, and you know, of course, I'm responding to your work on a visual level and seeing possibilities and trying to relate it to my own process. And then, but it's when we started speaking that it seemed generative. So I'm just kind of thinking, I know when you mentioned creating visual templates, one of the things that we did was I would send you images, and you would create these incredible tableaus of possibilities, which I thought was amazing. It was like I would send 1 or 2 examples of imagery that were content relevant to me, but that also had really, you know, specific form I'm so interested in, that I've worked in before. And then you would almost unfold it a million
well,
times
yeah.
into these diagrams that were, it was like kaleidoscopic. And that, to me, I guess what I'm talking about is that even the collaborative process itself, because of the way you use technology, was generative to me. Even that was part of, I think, the development of the concept, like as what was possible with this project. But I mean, maybe you could say more about that. But like, I would give you a crystal, calcite crystal. I'd say these corals, these crystals are the most important to me, because they are the exoskeleton basis of coral reefs. And for me, part of the whole project should be about, you know, both a place and a thing like a coral reef, and also a community like an ecosystem that is built around it. And so I give you a calcite crystal, but then you'd create this entire world out of the version of.
You have to blame museums. I did my research. I initially was paralyzed like by how many different forms even like simple this mineral can get. So I do remember I was in Berlin and just walked to this natural, I don't remember, it's like a natural history museum in New York, but it's called somehow in German. So and they had like huge area dedicated just to minerals. And I thought like, oh nice, I can like shoot some references for myself. And there was like a table, I don't know, 10 meters long, and under the glass there was like examples, and they like all of them were called the same, but they look completely different. And just like how I can like systemize, like yeah, it's just because it's how it works. It's like all calcite, but it could be like spiky calcite. It could like it's crazy how different these things could be. So when you showed me something, I like obviously do my like homework, doing like research for what's possible, and because again, because I was developing not the single piece, I was developing the system.
Yes.
That's why all these like crazy tables of different variations. That's where it come from, because I had to show you what the system is capable of.
Yes.
Not one piece. Like if you needed one crystal, you would do it yourself. There is no like generative thing in this.
We were looking towards making 10,000.
Yeah, because otherwise you can just like sculpt it and 3D scan and that's it.
Right.
That's the one piece kind of thing.
What's fascinating is they didn't exist. They only had to exist from possibilities.
Yeah,
right?
it's really interesting. It's again like a bit of an anxiety because how the project was organized, you didn't have like second chance, because you generated, you don't know the data in advance, then it happened and it's already on a blockchain and like image already there, so you don't have like a second shot. You can just like, oh, like that's a ugly looking crystal, I should rework it somehow. You don't have it's all automated from, and it's go on by its own.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
It's fascinating, the process. I mean, to me, that it seems the message or part of the process that comes out of what you're talking about is the shape almost of the process itself, which is like usually there's a way of looking at processes very chronological with material, you know, and causal. Like one thing happens, you respond. It happens again, you respond. But in this case, you're thinking way ahead.
Well, yeah,
And so
it still happens. Like all of this happens, but it happens before the project actually like started and released. So we have to do all these things and do a lot of testing, experiments, R&D. So you will be like at least 99% sure that the results will be predictable and look good.
Yeah.
So yeah, and for getting back to this collaborative process, it's funny because. Again, I'm not from like art world. I'm from production and post-production, so I'm used to a very kind of different way of organizing the process. And to me, again, it came very natural, because it was like you are the agency or like a film director, and you have like board of references. You do like pre-production kind of thing, and then hire me and say like, well, we like this in this image and that in that image, and the overall like concept is like that. So we have a script basically, and
it started that way.
Yeah,
it seemed to evolve more into. It was much more. I mean, content became more collaborative.
Yeah,
I think that was what was interesting to me.
Well, otherwise I would just quit. If it were just another studio project, like why bother?
Well, it's so important to me. I mean, because I was like, how can I collaborate? Also, like, how can I collaborate with someone who has such a sophisticated, already developed language and visual kind of palette, you know? And I have my own. And I was thinking, I wonder how this is going to work. So it was really unknown to me as well.
It worked well.
You know, I think I learned from that. I think that was like, to me, one of the things that still affects me. And maybe it didn't change how I think, but obviously my experience with collaborating with you and then via the kind of explicit technology that you gave me access to and provided within the project itself, made clear other things. Maybe, you know, maybe it's not only that it kind of affected and will continue to affect how I work or think, but it also made kind of clear what's, and not to sound too grand, but maybe a larger picture of how things are developing within art and technology. And
Well, it's another option for you. So you can you can just use it as one more tool. Like,
well, you've done many things too. I mean, I don't think of technology as just a tool, and I don't know if you do as well. But from the sound of how we were talking, or how you were discussing about how even a program, how it's designed, Houdini, generates this other possibility of a whole medium called generative art, and that just by how it's designed, it's almost like the technology is teaching. It's not a tool. It's almost like giving a kind of whole playground for telling you
that's the
what
thing.
you can do.
It doesn't restrict you. Because I had a lot of questions from like clients. Like, is it possible? They used to different approaches. So they just like having a task to do something, and then they ask me like, is it even doable? And I have to like always say like, yes, for sure. It's not about the tool, because it allows you to do anything literally, like in a visual way. So it's about time, which at the very end converts to budget. Like, if you have enough time, you can do literally anything. So there is no restriction, because other software, like 3D software, usually limits you. There is pre-built tools, and you can be like smart or creative in using them, but like combine them somehow. But at some point, you usually like find this wall, the border. Like you cannot push it further than that. In Houdini, it's not
That's
there.
such an interesting thing. I mean, to me,
it's a very like artist friendly, because you shouldn't have limits, right? The tools shouldn't limit you.
That, you know, objects usually contain meaning historically, right? They're supposed to be the vessel and holder of all this meaning. So you're supposed to look at it, and it is supposed to somehow, as you walk around it, contain meaning. But I think some things I learned, I feel from our conversations, and even just in hindsight of our collaboration, that's I guess still ongoing in a way, because OGCR is still alive as a project, is that I'm looking at OGCR as not a thing, but like a place or a site. It's almost like a black hole. So there's a black hole there. You see this black hole. It's a thing, but it's also a space in itself. And maybe the meaning of it, and this is way out there on a limb, but perhaps the meaning is not even inside the black hole. It's on the other side of it. And that's, I think, maybe a better character of this, because the project itself is spinning, has its own life. You can notice it's there. It's at the center. But if you try to extract the meaning from inside it, it's not possible. It's yet to come, in a way, and it's unfolding. And
that's because it's a process. Again,
it's a process.
It's not like a one piece which is finished and that's done.
Exactly.
Yeah, because it by the nature of the project itself, it was evolving, and because it brought together so many people. I mean, the community of owners and co-creators. It's almost like raising a child, but I mean, you spend some time, try to do your best to teach them something, but it's an independent creature. So they do whatever they want to do at some point.
Let's talk about that.
It's how the project works, because we are not like solely responsible for what's going on there. There are thousands of people, right? This different interests, some of them collectors, some came for money, some for other reasons. So you never know, because it's so many people. Like, if you have two, it's already like complicated to find like what two people want to do together. We have like
vision of
3,000.
Exactly.
It's
a very
crazy.
Different idea of community, right?
Yeah, it's like a, I don't know, like ant farm or something. So there is a place, but it's so many things happening inside. So it's like,
interesting. Like, it's a cross section. Right? You can see it all happening at once. So all you have to do is look one way, and things are being built here, and another way, and something else is happening here. But how can it also then talk back to the digital community? How can they go back and forth with each other? And I find
that's very like kind of hard question, right? You 99% will be wrong about everything about the future.
Totally.
But what I think OG Crystals showed, and the potential there, it's about blurring this border between like real life and digital. I mean, not should, but it will continue, this fluidity between like real world and art, and they influence each other more and more. It will continue, and probably the projects because there's like a new generation of people coming into art world and like the rest of the world,
Sure.
and they grew up like with understanding that digital things could be as valuable as real one.
Yeah.
And for some even more valuable. So they already live in this like digital realm. So and they probably like bring in this attitude to the rest of like real world transactions they have.
And I
So
think,
it's really interesting. And
yeah. I think that's where the real value as well of, you know, I hate to use the term, but a more traditional analog artwork and art practice that unfolds over real time, you know, over a kind of human scale time. And I think that's where it'll be interesting how that is going to become necessary, I think, in these accelerated timelines and accelerated perception of what's possible. How can that kind of more analog real world time, you know, bring us into that, into a space where we can kind of properly like work through these accelerated kind of realities. So
yeah, it's interesting. And it goes both ways. That's a funny way. So like for crystals, you can change it. It could be ever changing. It could be like for this moment it could be crystals, and next moment it could be butterflies.
That's
and
right.
Right. So we also we took something from real world, some like consistency in time. So that's technically it's an alien theme for digital, right? It could be ever changing. So we brought some concepts with us, saying like, well, in the real world, that's how it works, and we want to be true to this process, and brought it to digital realm. And so it's interesting how it's actually like interconnection of both worlds. That's where really interesting things happen.
That's a great point. That's look. Every time we speak, I get something new perceptually. So thanks, and great speaking with you again. In
Thank you. It was an honor to be a part of the project, and yeah, it's really.
네, 지금 그 마이크과 데닐의 인터뷰 영상을 보셨습니다. 무대에 신현우 선생님과 마이크를 초대해서 저희가 패널 디스커션을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 네, 영상을 재밌게 보셨는지 모르겠습니다. 지금 저희 무대에 같이 참여해 주신 신현우 선생님은 인공지능, 블록체인, 플랫폼, 게이밍 영역의 정보기술 문화와 미디어 정치 경제학을 연구하는 문화연구자이십니다. 현재 서울과학기술대학교 한국예술종합학교에서 기술문화이론과 아트 테크놀로지를 강의하고 계십니다. 그럼 저희 패널 디스커션에 앞서서 일단 마이클에게 이 무대에서 지금 상영되고 있는 이 스크린과 그다음에 지금 이 조각에 대해서 관람객들에게 좀 설명을 해주시기를 부탁드릴게요.
This what we show here. Yeah, and essentially what we're showing here is a bit of an animated sequence of some of the criteria of how the algorithm works. And in the center, just a collection that's on the left, basically. I think it's one of the slides I showed broke some of that down very loosely. And what we see in the center is a rough kind of, pastiche of, montage of different crystals. And on the right is more of kind of a collector's type of thing. It's like a homage to the kind of collector's card almost, which shows basically statistics of rarity and statistics of qualities of each of these crystals, which were embedded inside of all of them. So eventually, when the project finished, there are entities out there that track NFTs rarity and give it qualities and traits. Things like sites called Rarity Sniper and things. And it's basically almost fan and collector based, but also investor based, I guess. Ways of trying to determine what is special about various projects. So this is a breakdown of all of the different qualities, the generation, how many of them are yellow, how many of them are clear, how many of them are spiky, how many of them are, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that this kind of series of movements was something I'm, drawn to as explication. And what we see here are just some test prints, very small test prints that are at a smaller scale to what will be essentially parts of a reef. So these represent perhaps 2 to 3 different iterations of crystals. But if you can imagine 10,300 none of these joined together, we've just begun producing now with a partner here in Seoul, which is why I'm so excited to be here more and more, because I shouldn't be surprised, perhaps the best and most kind of environmentally sound production of these crystals I found as a partner here in Seoul. So we'll begin working much more with these here. And what it's displayed on in this case is simply a small video clip of actual second generation red algae growing on one of our crystals. So it's basically what happens is often there is one group of marine organism that grows onto the sculpture, and another generation comes and eats that, and then another generation comes and eats that. And so there's these successive generations that grow until eventually, if you're I don't know if you're lucky or if the form is correct, we don't know what the science is yet, calcium or calcite-based crystals will start to form. So.
네, 안녕하세요. 소개받은 신현우라고 합니다. 제가 처음 그 마이클 주스님 작품을 본 게 2006년, 7년 이때인데요. 그때 제가 대학생이었어요. 그리고 지금 이제 17년이 지났죠. 그 17년 동안 선생님의 작품 세계가 이렇게 끊임없이 급진적으로 변하는 것을 보고 저는 굉장히 큰 감명을 받았습니다. 그러니까 보통 이제 어떤 이제 예술가의 작품이 막 정점을 찍고 이렇게 막 매너리즘에 빠지기 마련인데 선생님 작품은 그렇지 않고 점점 나아가는 것 같아요. 특히 이제 NFT나 인공지능 같은 이제 신기술이 혁신을 이루고 있는 이제 국면에서 선생님 작품이 이제 이런 이제 시도를 한다는 것 자체가 굉장히 큰 이제 의미 있는 일이고, 특히 이제 NFT나 이제 크립토 커런시 같은 경우에는 최근에 이제 뭐 뉴스에서 많이 접하셨겠지만은 엄청난 사회적 문제를 또 야기하고 있는, 그러니까 그런 암울한 면도 같이 가지고 있는 어떤 이제 기술 이제 풍경이 아닐까, 그러니까 이렇게 생각이 듭니다. 선생님이 이렇게 또 소개해 주신 그 작품을 이제 보면은 최근에 저는 이제 그런 말을 이렇게 듣고 살아왔거든요. 그러니까 과학은 복잡성을 탐구하고 예술은 복잡성을 추구한다. 근데 이런 어떤 이제 불문율이 바뀌고 있는 것 같아요. 그러니까 마치 클라인 씨의 병처럼 예술과 과학 그리고 이제 테크놀로지를 통해서 이 두 가지가 안과 밖에 없는 이제 클라인 씨의 병처럼 이제 매개가 되고 있는 것이죠. 이런 이제 혁신적인 그 진보 기술들 그리고 이것들을 사유하는 가운데 그 마이클 주 스님께서 그 하시는 그 작업의 핵심은 아마도 그 경계 넘기가 아닐까 싶습니다. 그러니까 기술이 계속 지금 변하고 이제 혁신되고 있잖아요. 막 하루가 지나면 GPT가 나왔다, 또 하루가 지나면은 뭐 미드저니가 나왔다, 또 하루가 지나면 NFT 아트가 나왔다. 그러니까 정말 하루가 멀다 하고 이제 기술 혁신이 세계를 급변시키고 있습니다. 저는 이제 이제 기술 대가속의 시대에 그러니까 우리가 과연 이 기술을 예술적으로 전혀 할 수 있을까? 그러니까 이런 이제 의구심도 품고 있는데요. 오늘 선생님의 그 작업을 또 그 설명을 듣고 이제 하다 보면은 약간 이제 안도감도 생기고 그러니까 이런 이제 측면들이 있어요. 이제 이런 이제 신기술들이 단순히 이제 암호화폐뿐만이 아니라 다양한 이제 문화 창조 영역에서 우리의 삶들을 바꿔놓고 있죠. 그러니까 예를 들어서 제가 최근에 또 주목하고 있는 이제 게이밍 분야에서는 이제 게임 엔진을 가지고 애니메이션, 뭐 영화를 이제 만든다든지, 그다음에 이제 크립토 아트가 최근에 등장을 했죠. 한국에서도 이게 이 크립토 아트가 활발하게 이제 창작되고 있고요. 나아가서 이 크립토 아트가 기존의 이 예술 작품들이 가지고 있었던 아우라를 없애버리겠다. 그 경계를 넘어서겠다. 그러니까 이런 이제 야심찬 이제 기획들을 또 주창하고 있죠. 그러니까 단순히 기술과 기술 그리고 장르 사이의 그 경계를 허물 뿐만이 아니라 그러니까 이런 이제 사유를 해야 되는 순간들인 것 같아요. 물질과 비물질 그리고 이제 주체와 객체 그리고 또 나아가서 이제 인간과 비인간 이런 것들의 이제 경계를 어떻게 우리가 넘어설 수 있을까? 선생님 작업들이 이제 그런 것들과 굉장히 큰 연관을 가지고 있는 것 같습니다. 그리고 한편으로 이제 3D 프린팅 그리고 앞에 지금 이제 실제로 제가 이 크리스탈을 이제 봤는데요. 이게 대체 뭘까? 이것들이 또 이게 실제로 이게 산호초 안에 이제 심어지고 임플란트되고 이 안에서 또 새로운 이제 생태계가 이제 변하는 모습, 인공물과 자연물들이 이렇게 섞이면서 이 이제 경계가 아주 완전히 접경으로 변하는 이제 풍경들 이런 것들이 굉장히 이제 인상적인 것 같습니다. 그러니까 피지털 이제 풍경을 이제 우리가 보고 있는 거죠. 지금 눈앞에 있습니다, 지금. 그래서 저는 이제 이런 이제 작업들을 보면서요, 저는 이제 그런 이제 질문이 들었습니다. 선생님의 그 작업이, 그러니까 저는 이제 그런 거라고 생각을 하거든요. 이 물질적 대상성에 대한 변증법적 조형술이다. 왜 변증법인가? 그러니까 우리가 보통 이제 이런 이제 사물들이나 물건들을 이제 보면은 이게 정주 상태에 있다고 생각을 해요. 그러나 그것은 어디까지나 인간의 생애주기, 인간의 시공간 개념을 통해서만 이제 그렇게 보여지는 것입니다. 사실 사물은 끊임없이 생동하고 변화하고 있죠. 사물 또한 이 생태계에서 하나의 행위자입니다. 인간만의 행위자가 아니고요. 이렇게 사물권이라고 하는 긴 주기를 통해서 보면은 이 눈앞에 있는 이 조그만 사물부터 해서 선생님께서 창조하신 크리스탈들도 끊임없이 변하고 있는 것입니다. 그것들을 이제 기술이 보여주고 있는 것이죠. 다시 말해서 대상성 자체가 해체되고 있다는 것입니다. 예술가가 만들어낸 이제 작품과 예술가 사이의 그 경계들을 선생님께서 그 경계 넘기를 이렇게 시도하시는 것 같아요. 근데 대상성이 사라진다는 건요. 그러니까 내가 이제 주체가 이 대상들을 보고 인식하고 느끼고 그것들을 이제 머릿속에서 이미지네이션하는 이 이제 프로세스 자체를 이제 허문다라는 거거든요. 나만의 어떤 나만의 시각, 나만의 사상, 나만의 어떤 그 지향 이런 것들을 가지고 사물을 상상하고 재현하는. 그러니까 이런 이제 그러니까 여기서 이제 주체가 이제 사라진단 말이에요. 그 대상성이 이제 해체되고. 그러니까 저는 이제 그 첫 번째 질문은 이제 그거였어요. 이 이제 일련의 크립토 아트 작업들을 하면서 선생님께서 이제 지금까지 해왔던 요 작업들의 그 예술가들은 굉장히 또 완고한 존재이기도 하잖아요. 나만의 어떤 이제 상상, 사고 이런 것들 투영시켜서 나의 어떤 이제 에고를 이제 만들어 나가는 과정인데 이것들이 이제 기술에 의해서 일임되고 기술에 의해서 탈중앙화된다는 거죠. 그러니까 그런 생각을 할 수도 있을 것 같아. 내 작업이 내 작업물이 해체되는 거 아닐까? 내 작업물이 내 영감이 내 영성이 누군가에게 뺏기는 것은 아닐까? 혹은 이것들이 난 파편화돼서 이렇게 막 흩뿌려지는 것은 아닐까? 이런 어떤 근대적 불안감 이런 것들이 있으셨을 것 같은데 거기에 대한 선생님의 생각은 어떠신지 한번 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that question to me fundamentally begins to point to the idea of authorship in a way, and the idea of authorship, although I'm going to use this very loosely because I don't believe as an artist that necessarily to do away with authorship is my goal or interest, but I am very interested in the idea that everything around us points from AI technology to the natural world, and what we're kind of beginning to accept more and more, that we're not the sole actors at the center of all of the action, and that the individual is part of a much bigger system. I mean, this might sound very simplistic. I mean, we're all very aware of this with, you know, kind of conscientiousness about environment and climate and society as we know it, and social justice. But in many other ways, if we look to really, you know, things to back it up, we're looking at things as simple as the bacteria in our stomach, you know, influencing our hormones, right? And saying maybe that our brain doesn't control everything. Maybe even the bacteria in our stomach controls our brain. Or maybe, for instance, AIs, you know, maybe, for instance, what we have created as a technology that we fed everything about our culture is now teaching us what it wants. And so all of these kinds of things that are influencing how we decentralize the notion of the individual, I think are starting to happen. And so I don't think I would want to, as an artist, you know, I don't think we're ready for like the idea of eliminating authorship, and neither am I interested. I'm really interested in hearing what someone else has to say. It's within that kind of energy, or seeing what someone makes, trying to interpret where they're coming from. I mean, I think that's where the great kind of innovation, you know, comes from, and one of the benefits of art, you know, why it's accepted as kind of out of the box thinking, or whatever it might be, is that kind of idea of a creative gesture not necessarily having to have a reason, not having to have a strategic plan, or not having to have a logical place, you know, and yet it can teach us something. And perhaps some of that is in the energy that's created between individuals. So I'm not down with, you know, getting rid of the author, but I am interested in this idea that maybe we can rechange our way of seeing what the kind of individual place or actor is within a larger system, and start to kind of expand our idea of, you know, kind of make a more sophisticated or whatever, a changing effort into how we see collectivity and collaborative efforts, and even appreciate other art forms and other kinds of ways of thinking into a more integrated society. Like you say, science and art maybe are connected. I'm super jealous of fashion and music a lot of the times, because they move at a speed where the object is not final. It's the kind of integration of their perception, or their wearability, or their use, that creates a kind of response. And cooking is the same, perhaps. So I mean, there's so many different ways that these kind of creative acts, you know, rejoin. And none of them require a loss of authorship. But I hope that's somewhat of an answer.
네, 선생님 말씀해 주셔서 감사합니다. 전적으로 이렇게 동의하는 바이고요. 그러니까 어서십이라고 하는 것이 점점 제가 볼 때는 이제 이제 기술에 의해서 완전히 다른 방식으로 재구성될 것 같긴 합니다. 뭐 이제 우리가 지금 보고 있는 파인 아트 이제 분야뿐만이 아니라, 그러니까 일반적인 어떤 서브컬처 영역에서도 이런 이제 지각 변동이 일어나고 있거든요. 그래서 그러니까 이 어떠십이라기보다는 Authors Association, 그러니까 뭐 이런 개념에 더 적합할 수도 있겠다, 뭐 이런 이제 생각을 하고 있습니다. 또 다른 제 질문이 이제 하나 있는데요. 그러니까 선생님 제 작업이 워낙 재밌었기 때문에 여러 가지로 좀 이렇게 생각을 해봤습니다. 좀 이제 테크니컬한 측면들부터 해서 미학적인 측면들까지 좀 다방면으로 좀 그러니까 고민을 해봤는데, 그러니까 제가 아직 이제 풀리지 않았던 의문은 이제 한 군데 있었습니다. 어떤 것이냐면요. 그러니까 블록체인이 이제 태생적인 기술 코드를 이제 가지고 있는데, 이제 기술 코드라고 하는 것은 사실 이제 1980년대에 이 탈중앙화 이제 기술 자체가 생겨나면서 어떤 이제 이데올로기가 이제 확실했었다라는 거예요. 그러니까 1985년도에 그 데이비드 차움이라고 하는 이제 공학자가 이제 빅브라더로부터 탈출할 수 있는 이제 금융 기술에 관하여라는 이제 이렇게 논문을 쓰게 되는데, 이것이 이제 블록체인의 발단이 되게 되고, 그러니까 이것들이 이제 윌리엄 깁슨 같은 이제 사이버펑크 그러니까 소설가들에서부터 일반적인 어떤 이제 컴퓨터 테키들에 이르기까지 굉장히 많은 사람들에 의해서 우리가 이제 영성 혁명의 영역이라고만 생각했던 이 사이버펑크가 실질적인 혹은 이제 물질적인 영역에서 가능하다. 우리의 그 정신과 의식을 해방시켜서 이 이제 월드 와이드 웹에 이제 구현시키는 건 어떨까? 그리고 이제 만약 그것이 가능하다면은 완전히 자유로운 기존의 그 정치, 경제 혹은 이제 기업의 감시로부터 그 자유로운 공간을 만들어야 되는데 그러면 이제 이 사람들이 생각했던 건 이제 그거예요. 그러니까 기존의 화폐 시스템으로부터 우리가 이제 탈주해야만 한다. 그러니까 쉽게 말해 수목적인 이제 그 경제가 아니라 리좀적인 경제를 만들어야 된다. 그러니까 그런 이제 아이디어 하에서 만들어진 거거든요. 그래서 그러니까 이런 어떤 자유 이데올로기가 존재하고 있었는데 이게 이제 2009년 이후로는 이제 비트코인이죠. 비트코인 이후로는 조금 이렇게 다른 방식으로 전유되는 또 흐름들이 보인다. 그러니까 우리가 이제 목격하다시피 그러니까 이제 블록체인 기반 암호화폐 거래 94%가 폰지 사기에 취약하다고 합니다. 실제로 그런 일들이 많이 벌어지고 있고 국내에서는 이제 막 그 뭐 루나코인, 테라코인 뭐 이런 이제 사건 사고들이 막 연이어서 일어나고 있죠. 왜 그런가 살펴봤는데 이제 크게 이제 두 가지가 있습니다. 이 블록체인을 이제 구성하고 있는 이제 기술적인 이제 코드가 작업 증명 방식, proof of work, 그다음에 지분 증명 방식, proof of stake. 이 두 가지 이제 방식에 의해서 이제 그 거래 이제 원장이 형성되고 이제 거래가 이제 성립이 되고 그다음에 이제 뭐 이제 쉽게 말해 채굴 같은 이제 행위들이 가능해지는 것이죠. 근데 이제 제가 이제 많은 이제 그 전문가들이 지적하듯이 그러니까 이것이 이제 승자 독식 구조로 되어 있기 때문에 큰 사회적 문제를 야기를 하고 있습니다. 그러니까 이제 탈중앙화 네트워크에 접속되어 있는 사람들이 동시에 작업을 이렇게 수행해도 채굴에 성공한 사람은 이제 한 사람밖에 없는 거죠. 그다음에 이제 뭐 프루프 오브 스테이크 방식도 마찬가지입니다. 이 블록체인 네트워크에 참여하고 있는 사람 중에서 가장 많은 블록체인을 이제 지분을 가지고 있는 사람이 그 의사 결정에 더 이제 깊이 참여할 수 있는 거죠. 그러니까 이제 주식 주주총회 할 때 이제 주식을 많이 가진 사람이 더 많은 영향을 행사하는 그런 이제 메커니즘이랑 이제 비슷하다고 볼 수가 있습니다. 물론 제 선생님 작업은 이제 이런 그러니까 거래 이제 기반이 아니라 창조 기반이기 때문에 이런 이제 그 개입이 없거나 혹은 이제 덜 하겠지만은 그럼에도 불구하고 이 완전히 금융 경제에 의해서 전유되어 버린 이 자유주의자들의 꿈, 80년대 사이버펑크주의자들의 꿈들이 어떻게 다시 이제 부활할 수 있을까요? 그러니까 선생님들의 작업 속에서 그러니까 이런 어떤 그 자유 이데올로기들이 다시 새롭게 우리를 해방시킬 수 있는 그 동력들을 그 미학적인 실천들을 어떻게 찾을 수 있을까요? 거기에 대해서 선생님 의견이 어떠신지 한번 궁금합니다.
That's a great question. I mean, I think that there's a huge questions I often have with my brother, who is a law professor in Davis, and who speaks often about the idea of the ledger and the idea of the possibilities of the kind of ability to kind of corrupt and take advantage of what takes place within a kind of unsecure and rewritten kind of set of rules all the time, even though like a banking system arguably in a traditional sense, and I don't want to get too deep into this because I'm no expert at this, still is a subjective kind of entity that everyone's decided says this is okay. And in a way, the idealism, I think, of the kind of cryptocurrency within a larger blockchain sphere was just that there's more freedom to destabilize the subjectivity of that, and that every single action within blockchain would just be not real, but a question of a consensus, right? So that ledger entry would be a consensus, but it doesn't eliminate subjectivity, right? Because there's still a lot of different ways of creating new currencies and new banks and new kind of players. So, I guess I can't answer your question directly from that standpoint, but what I would say is what I'm encouraged by is the fact that more and more artists or people becoming involved or interested are able to mint and create and kind of access their own kind of release of material. And within that kind of idea of a release of material, maybe they'll be successful, maybe they won't, but they'll be forming communities around work. And these sub-communities become interesting little models of complex organisms, mean, I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb and be super abstract here for a second, but it's like I was thinking about the idea of the individual before, right? I was kind of going off on the idea of changing an idea of what's not authorship, but the idea of the individual. And I think in some ways we've already said that once, at some point someone said, when a single-celled organism got together with another one, we became more complex. We became individuals, right? But it's like the single cell is already incredibly complex. And so these systems were already happening. So I think that these smaller kind of subgroups of artists creating, forming communities and rejoining into the other communities is rather, a positive development. I think that right now we're seeing an art world that is not destabilized, but that's coming to grips with things like NFTs, with cryptocurrency, with blockchain. And I don't think that there's an answer I could provide for that. And neither do I think has to totally destabilize that. But so I'm curious, I guess I would ask you, what do you think is possible from your standpoint, coming from, say, perhaps gaming, coming from other kinds of possibilities where there are creators, content creators, artists ostensibly, that make, that draw, that release, that have possibilities to mint, that have multiple identities maybe. Maybe one job is to be a gaming person, maybe another job is just to be data visualization or even a motion graphics person, or even a generative artist. What do you think? Because I think you're exposed to these communities that actually, are native online. I think I come from one where artists are trying to get their heads around how this makes sense to them, and oftentimes it's a really dissatisfying kind of treatment that galleries and, a lot of artists have, which is basically from lack of knowledge of what's possible, is to just take a picture and turn it into a token, or to take something and basically use it at face value rather than seeing that token or that NFT. I don't think NFT is going to be an appropriate word soon, but as a portal, as a gateway, it just stands for a ticket that allows you entrance to something else. But again, Mike, I think I have more of a question for you, and what is your perception of that with creators and artists? Is it possible?
굉장히 이제 역시 이제 선생님께서 큰 질문으로 이렇게 돌려주셨네요. 그러니까 중요한 것은 이제 뭐 아까 선생님께서 그 NFT란 말 자체가 조금 이렇게 수정돼야 된다고 말씀하셨는데 거기에 저도 전적으로 이렇게 동의하는 바입니다. 지금 현재 NFT 개념은 그러니까 우리가 어쨌든 디지털적 그 존재의 그 대상 속에서 이제 어떤 가치를 만들어낼 것인가가 중요한데, 현재 NFT 개념은 그러니까 이제 금전적인 가치에 조금 더 이렇게 무게 중심이 있는 것 같고, 그래서 이렇게 좀 일종의 이제 버블이 있는 것 같습니다. 그러니까 제가 재작년인가 이제 봤던 그 비플의 작업, 그러니까 그 5,000 days. 그러니까 이 경우에도 저는 굉장히 이제 그 좋은 그 작업이라고 생각을 하지만은 크리스티 경매에서 그 세계에서 역대 네 번째로 비싼 막 그 작품으로 이렇게 등재되었더라고요. 근데 우리가 어쨌든 이제 어떤 이 예술의 그 예술계 안에서 예술의 어떤 시간 속에서 이렇게 살아가고 있는 존재로서 이것이 막 그렇게까지 이제 거품을 이제 이 NFT로 우리가 그러니까 이야기할 수 있을까? 그러니까 이런 이제 의문들이 조금 있긴 있습니다. 다만 그러니까 우리가 이 예술계의 개념을 조금 더 이제 확장을 해보자면요. 그러니까 과거에는 이제 이 예술계가 이제 예술가들과 예술가 혹은 이제 예술가들과 비평가들 사이의 어떤 이제 네트워크, 행위성, 그리고 이들 간의 어떤 관계 속에서 만들어지는 이 시공간적 개념이라고 생각해 왔지만은 그게 이 이제 디지털적 존재의 어떤 이제 네트워크 안에서는 조금 확장이 돼가고 있는 것 같습니다. 그러니까 이용자와 뭐 제작자, 디자이너와 뭐 구매자, 그다음에 이제 뭐 게임 플레이어와 뭐 이제 그 게임 이제 뭐 제작자, 이런 식의 다양한 이제 어떤 행위자 그 네트워크로 좀 이렇게 확장되고 있는 것 같고요. 저는 아까 이제 이제 다니엘 씨와의 인터뷰에서도 그러니까 그런 이제 단초를 얻었는데요. 처음에 이게 디스코드에서 그 커뮤니케이션을 하고, 그러니까 디스코드가 이제 원래 이제 게임 이제 게이머들의 이제 커뮤니케이션 이제 도구였죠. 근데 이 이제 게이머들이 커뮤니티 안에서 그러니까 이 이제 소통하는 방식들을 보면은 저는 이 일종 이제 뭐 그 버추얼한 이제 그 가상의 어떤 이제 커뮤니티임에도 불구하고 현실보다 그 훨씬 더 이렇게 실천적이거나 그 끈끈한 측면들을 많이 발견하게 됩니다. 예를 들어서 이제 뭐 마인크래프트 같은 경우, 우리가 그것을 이제 샌드박스형 게임으로 이제 그 내놓았지만은 오픈 소스로 되어 있기 때문에 다양한 방식으로 우리가 이제 조정을 할 수가 있죠. 뭐 이제 건축이라든지 아니면은 이제 아이들에게 술래잡기라든지 그뿐만이 아니라 상용화된 게임 중에서도 오픈 소스로 이렇게 공개되어 있고 그 툴을 가지고 다양한 자기만의 방식으로 이제 게임을 만드는 이제 모드 제작, 그러니까 모딩이라고 하죠. 그러니까 이런 이제 영역들도 있고 이 안에서 끊임없이 그 대화하고 소통한다는 말이에요. 그래서 그러니까 이 게임 엔진이 이런 식의 결함을 가지고 있는데 우리가 이런 식으로 좀 바꿔 나가면 어떨까? 아, 이게 중세 판타지를 배경으로 하고 있는데 뭐 SF로 바꿔놓으면 어떨까? 이런 이제 대화들을 하게 되고 실제로 이 프로젝트에 참여한 이제 수많은 이제 모더들이 이제 게임의 외형과 내적인 어떤 이제 이 알고리즘을 변형시킨다라는 것이죠. 저는 이제 이러한 어떤 이제 커뮤니케이션 이제 과정이 충분히 이제 크립토 이제 아트 이제 씬에서도 그 적용될 수 있다라고 생각을 합니다. 어쨌든 이제 과정 생성적인 이 어떤 과정 생성 자체가 하나의 그 예술, 그래서 예술계를 만드는 이제 과정이 될 것이기 때문에, 그러니까 다만 이제 그런 의문은 있어요. 그러니까 이게 탈중앙화 네트워크에서 거래를 할 때마다 이 작품이 이렇게 생성되고 이제 변형되는 이제 방식이기 때문에, 아까 제가 말씀드린 이제 이 게이머 커뮤니티 안에서 사람들이 대화로, 그러니까 이야기를 나누는 방식과는 조금 이게 다르다라는 말이죠. 그러니까 우리는 이제 보통 이것들을 정체성의 접합이라고 얘기를 합니다. 나의 성별, 뭐 인종, 그다음에 세대, 내가 살고 있는 지역, 여기에 따라서 우리가 가지고 있는 이제 문화적인 결들을 가지고 대화를 하는 거죠. 그러니까 뭐 이제 그러니까 나는 이제 이 한국에 살고 있는 사람이고, 나는 뭐 미국에 살고 있는 사람이고, 나는 북반구에 살고 있는 사람이고, 남반구에 살고 있는 사람. 그러니까 제각기 가지고 있는 어떤 문화적 결들이 다르기 때문에 이걸 가지고 이렇게 대화를 하거든요. 이걸 가지고 협상을 하고 의미를 생산하고 그 의미들을 이제 공유한단 말입니다. 근데 이제 이 이제 크립토 이제 아트에서 이제 이런 의미들을 우리가 다시 말해 이 수행성의 어떤 영역들을 어떻게 공유하고 할 수 있을까? 그러니까 이것은 이제 프로토콜과 이제 그 기계적인 어떤 실행성 안에서 이렇게 돌아가고 있는 이제 이 알고리즘 영역이기 때문에 이런 이제 인간적인 어떤 그 대면들, 그러니까 인간적인 어떤 수행 언어들이 부딪히고 이렇게 새로운 의미를 이렇게 생성하는 이제 과정들 이런 것들을 이제 구현하는데 저는 이제 큰 관심이 있습니다. 그러니까 그런 것들을 이제 할 수 있어야 되는데요. 그러니까 지금 그뭐 선생님의 작업을 이렇게 조금 이렇게 두고 봐야 되겠지만은 저는 그게 이제 가능할 거라고 저는 생각합니다. 다만 그게 가능하기 위해서는 수많은 이제 사람들이 참여할 수 있고 이 소스들에게 접근할 수 있고 선생님께서 아까 토큰을 이렇게 다 주어줘야 된다고 말씀하셨는데요. 전적으로 동의합니다. 이 토큰들을 가지고 그러니까 이 가치를 아까 제가 처음에 이제 가치라고 말씀드렸는데 교환 가치나 잉여 가치가 아닌 우리 문화적인 혹은 되게 대화적인 혹은 친밀감의 가치를 이제 만들 수 있는 그런 이제 토큰들이 필요하겠다. 그러니까 그런 것들이 만약에 우리가 이제 생성할 수 있고 가질 수 있다면은 충분히 선생님께서 말씀하신 그러니까 제가 아까 처음 질문드렸던 이 사이버펑크의 어떤 자유 그것들이 가능하지 않을까? 뭐 이런 이제 생각을 해보게 됩니다.
네, 지금 사실 더 질문할 것이 많은데 저희가 시간 관계상 이번 세션은 여기서 정리를 하도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 온라인으로 참여하고 계신 분들은 질문이 있으시면 저희가 이제 세션이 다 끝나면 다시 Q&A를 가질 텐데요. 온라인에 질문창에 질문을 남겨주시면 저희가 수합하도록 하겠습니다. 그럼 다음에는 그 메가락과 마이클 주 선생님의 녹화 영상된 영상을 보시고 마지막 패널 디스커션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
Hi, John. Hi, John. Coming to you from Brooklyn, New York. How's it there in Hilo today?
Warm and sunny summer in Hilo.
Sounds good. I'm here with John Burns from the Mega Lab, who our project OGCR and myself have been collaborating with for since the inception almost, and before. I guess we've been in conversation since before even the mint of this project, really, right, John? I think we met when I was doing research for this project in a way.
Yeah, we started having discussions about just the general overlap of artistic endeavors and science endeavors, and where there was ways to kind of inject creativity from one into the other. And then the more we started talking about the crystal project, just because it's bounded by that concept of these coral crystal structures, it really kind of snowballed from there and started developing into more specific ideas of ways that the two different concepts could work synergistically together.
That's amazing. I mean, I was interviewing different labs or trying to meet different people involved in the field. Your name came up through Randy Kosaki from NOAA, and I think from the beginning, you're kind of obviously at the Mega Lab, and your work in data science, dealing with things that are visual in order to kind of move into understanding things in the research field and that relate directly to science is fascinating to me. So the beginning of that conversation was great. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate or tell us more about, how kind of our collaborations taken place, and more about your process, or the process that, from your perspective, which I've not always gotten, of how we were able to work together.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, the science art overlap is something that's exists whether people are aware of it or not. So, there's a requirement, if you will, in science in a way to be a creative thinker, in the sense that the ideas are very dynamic, and that is very parallel to art, in my opinion, where it's never static. If you think of a basic art class, right, it's not taught as, and then we hit this period where everything was the same, and then nothing was ever introduced again. And I started to recognize that science and scientists themselves don't always do a good job of like appreciating the evolution of ideas through time. And so it's pretty easy to get stagnant. And early in my endeavors that were very data science focused, we started getting big into the power of visualization and how visualization tools really open your mind to different perspectives. As a simple example, I could just be looking at data in a spreadsheet, and it's very hard to make sense and see patterns and numbers. But if I present that in different forms or shapes or structures, if you will, like all of a sudden I can see things that didn't exist before. And a lot of art is similar to that, right? You're trying to get someone to see or feel an emotion through a medium. It may not be directly linked, but the pattern is there. And what fascinated me initially was how many folks on the science side thought, oh, I mean, that's not science. You're not doing science. You're just visualizing things. That's not science. That's not how we're used to doing it, which was a bummer to me. And then on the same side, when I would reach out with artists and we started creating, we went so far as to make classes where we would use artists and graphic designers with scientists to try and come up with ways of like sharing and telling ideas to people through various mediums. And often the artists think, oh, I mean, I'm not a scientist, though. I can't really speak on this. I'm not a scientist. And so it was great to start doing these projects with you, in the sense that you're very aware, I think, because of the style of art that you do, that there is a very scientific process. It's something you've sort of thought about a lot and could articulate well. So it wasn't as though either of us needed to convince the other that there was value. Neither saw it as two worlds, but just a continuum, which it is, right? All thought lands somewhere on a continuum. Yeah. And so I started recognizing that these structures you were making for the OGCR project were really fascinating, because we think about reef structure all the time, like the physical mechanics of it, the dimensionality of it, and the structure itself dictates the habitat dictates the life. So you have this really an intense fundamental connection from like structure to the function of the ecosystem. And we test that very simplistically, as in we might put a square plate on the reef and say what settles and grows on that. And it's not easy for us to come up with like a creative array of structures. And so the OGCR like entities, the coral crystals themselves, were this beautifully, from my perspective, random structures of various shapes and forms. And so it provided this really phenomenal medium where we could say, whoa, what if we put that on the reef and we look at what grows on it? All of a sudden now I'm removing like my bias of what the structure should be, and I'm getting this purely objective view from all these different dynamic shapes and sizes of these crystals, right? Like some are very crystal shaped, some are very coral. So it goes from sharp to smooth. And so we get this gradient of better understanding reef growth in a way that is not biased by the scientists, which is really powerful, right? Because getting an unbiased perspective of nature is very difficult and extremely informing.
Wow, that's fascinating. I think that, really illuminating to me as well. I know that in the OGCR program itself and the kind of programming and coding for the algorithms, we're similarly, I guess, coming from a digital realm where data is being assembled to generate form. So in a way, we're not controlling form. We're kind of letting rules and laws of nature as we understood how to program them, based on crystallography and crystal growth, come into play and basically, kind of generate the forms. But so there is a principle, like an active principle of that underlies everything, which is calcite crystals, and which were chosen specifically because they're the basis for the kind of crystalline structure, the exoskeletons of the coral. And from my perspective as an artist, and my particular practice and interest in sculpture and objects, I like very interested in the place and the thing being a place, and it's kind of multiple identities. And so it was fascinating to me that you saw randomness, and in a way, I've been working so unusually and in an unaccustomed to me, in a kind of very unrandom feeling, kind of directional, conceptual parameter, but to generate forms that nature might have made, but I guess couldn't have or wouldn't have except for the project. And so yeah, it was really illuminating to see your response. I was actually the kind of positive nature of it and the angle that you saw in actually applying it to something that might be useful was fascinating. Just wondering if you had more you could tell me about the idea of how these that kind of study might take place, or how that kind of research might actually be beneficial.
Yeah. So just as you said, like to me, that the randomness, as I saw it, is in the way that we're always trying very hard. It's a very complicated process to, again, like objectively observe and study the environment, right? Like you take it down to the basic level of physics, and we're aware that our observation sort of affects behavior in nature. So it's really difficult to be purely objective. And so the intense amount of work that your group had done to try, as you pointed out, right, like derive from these algorithmic processes, like true forms that could be created in nature following natural processes, but there's an unpredictability. And so that's where I see the beauty of nature, is the randomness is such in the sense that a tree will be a tree. We know a tree is a tree, but why don't two trees grow in the exact same forms, right? That's that unexpected outcome that as scientists, we're constantly chasing these simplistic observational differences. And on a reef, it's no different. I see two corals side by side. They're never exactly the same. They never grow into the same forms. They don't support the exact same life. And the obvious question is why? So when you produced the structures and we saw them, I realized from a recruitment perspective, there's a fascinating opportunity here where we can place them on a reef. In particular, we have a location where we deploy oceanographic sensors and a live streaming camera to watch a reef, all year long, 24/7. And so we have the ability to put things on this structure without damaging or harming the natural reef. So it's like a very non-intrusive process. And then we can place them and not only watch in real time, but then study the progress. And so as an example, it's very valuable for us to know, do small coral larvae, right, in their earliest form of their life, do they have a preference to settle on like a smooth surface that maybe is more akin to a coral style surface, or some of the more rigid and jagged crystalline like surfaces that you made? So each OGCR entity or crystal, if you will, is different, has unique characteristics. And then because you derived them in a way that to me is very scientific, we can quantify that. So it's not as though I just have to say, oh, this is crystal 1 and that's crystal 7. I can like measure that structure. And that's what we do on the reef with our 3D mapping techniques, is we literally pinpoint, oh, this degree of fractal dimensionality or this degree of ruggedness will produce more of these 4 assemblages of fish. So we can find direct connections between structure and life. And so in this case, the structure of these art pieces informs us about the early stages of life on a reef. And that's a very active area of study. I mean, research groups around the world are doing this. I don't want to make it appear as though this is unique to us, but the opportunity to take these pieces of art that are just beautifully, perfectly suited for that type of scientific approach is unique. And that's something special. And then I think going back to what we talked about in the beginning, right? Like now you're really having art and science cohesively working together. It's not as though one is assisting the other or a small part of the other. They're fused together. And in the end, undeniably, you're going to learn something you wouldn't have had the capacity to otherwise. And so those are the moments where I realize, hey, this is worth trying, because successful or not, we're going to learn a lot.
That's fantastic. I mean, that's the spirit in the studio as well, in a certain way. And that site that you mentioned, it so much reminds me of the kind of fusion of a lab and a studio at the same time. And the site where the camera is active, where I know you would already have this ongoing research of really live streaming time. And I mean, that fascinates me as well, that your work in a way works, as you mentioned, with time and the idea of time and the kind of resilience that you've mentioned of the coral reefs and of kind of the oceanic ecosystems that you study, and their resilience in time is fascinating. That that you use a medium that's kind of out of time, that's a digital medium, to record moments in time that allow us to access these slices. I mean, they're such elaborate, big kinds of immersive recordings, I feel like you do. And I think that's something that, in a way, makes me think of the kind of a concept of these ecosystems and larger communities, this kind of very immersive, unpinpointable, decentralized kinds of ways of looking at, place or thing. And I'm just wondering, in that kind of like idea of communities, how do you do you see any kind of parallels in the ideas of the communities kind of generated by, our art communities, art discourse, potential for science communities and science discourse, and where we might meet? I think the Megalab's kind of about that in some ways, right? Bringing science in an alternative way to a larger audience. But I wonder if you could speak more about that.
I think that if you look at science collectively, and it's something that's spoken about all the time, whether you're at conferences or agency meetings or whatever it might be, there is a solid awareness that we don't do the best job communicating. And the last few years really put that front and center in most people's consciousness, in the sense of, I think it was one of the most fervent times of debate around science. Obviously, I'm sort of referencing to the pandemic time, right, where there was a lot of views of science and where it's good and where it's bad and the harms and the foul, and are scientists lying to people? What do scientists really do? And you can agree or disagree with any part of that, but I think if I challenge anyone, imagine a scientist there's a vast majority of people that will just sort of imagine, someone in a lab coat in a lab with beakers and, like goggles on. And so we have a pretty simplified understanding of what they are, but scientists are people. People are very bizarre in their own right and come in all shapes and sizes. And so it's really crazy to try and put them into simple categories or ways to understand them. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying we need to do a much better job communicating who we are and what we're trying to do. And so, yeah, in the Mega Lab, we try to connect with people that are very scientifically minded, which to us tends to be folks in the art world, also folks in action sports and adventure and places where you build strong connections to the environments that you're and that you interact with. And so there's sort of a heightened level of awareness. And so we don't want to diminish. I don't want to talk to someone who might be a professional freediver, let's just say, and talk to them about what they do and what they see when they're on the ocean. I should never go, well, I mean, I'm a scientist, so obviously my opinion's more valid or I know more than you. I think the challenge for a lot of scientists is to step back and say, wow, there's all these other people that spend a lot of time in these environments thinking about them, trying to represent them in various ways or to communicate about them. Let's learn from one another. Let's work together and let's all try get, a better awareness and understanding of our environment and our world. And that's what we're doing. Art represents the eye of the artist. It's what they see. People are showcasing stories. Scientists are selling stories too, just in typically a much more analytical, data heavy way, but they are. So to kind of refine the answer to your question, I think everyone's trying to tell these stories about the people and places they're working in. And if we can bring scientists and artists together, we just stand a much better chance. We're more powerful. We then create a broader perspective as a team, and that's where our minds start to open. And once people can open their minds, I think it helps you continue to get more knowledge into your brain, right? That's where I'm a big advocate of that. You close off your mind to ideas and different things in the world. Where are you going to add more information? How do you keep growing? So time can be a very valuable thing that way if you're willing to open and start to view new perspectives. And I think that's what the communication affords you.
Amazing. I mean, it's amazing all the possibilities and avenues for generating form and through communities and for generating discourse and stories, as you were saying. And I'm really, really interested personally as well in that nexus that you mentioned of the kind of sports, action sports, kind of athletic, potentially community as well being involved and their own personal vested interest, of course, in reset via, I guess, surf breaks, et cetera, free diving for the underwater mapping and terrain that represents for what they could possibly explore. So I'm wondering if you could speak more about that. I know the Mega Labs is also comprised of quite a bit of, surfers. You're a surfer yourself. There are others in the team that are, professionally involved even, that truly straddle many worlds. So
yeah, we've all crossed over in different realms. And so, Cliff, Haunani, and myself, we're sort of the three principal investigators, if you will, which basically means we have PhDs in disciplines. We work at universities, and we sort of have in our job description is the motive to conduct research in a certain domain. So Cliff is a chemist, Haunani is a geologist, I'm a biologist. We then have a large team of people of different expertise, from graduate students to technicians. We're all trying to study the oceans to better understand them. We also try to make technologies and give them to the people that need them the most, right? Like communities and places that can benefit from these tools. Like we want to be very proactive in creating and conducting science that has value to the people and the places where we work. Where that motivation comes from touches on what you mentioned, where, Cliff is a professional surfer. Haunani's one of the very, few navigators of the Hokulea. She's
amazing.
And she's an incredibly accomplished surfer as well. I wish I had as many accolades as them, but, I surf and I skateboard and I fish. And I take those things very seriously. And when we all met, it was on these parts of our lives that wasn't the science focus. And we all bonded over that reality of it's not often done enough. if you don't take risks, you don't have new discoveries. It's really important for progression. And progression ties back to a lot of what we do, you know, talking about that crossover into action sports, into art, all of it. You always want to progress. If you stagnate, that's a dark it's a dark time in the career. You want to keep moving forward.
That's amazing. Thanks, John. I know that you're incredibly busy out in the ocean in the lab. So thanks. I'm really excited about going forward with this collaboration. And I know we're still in early days. So thanks for taking the time, and look forward to seeing you in Hilo again soon.
Right on. Yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks, Michael.
All right.
네, 방금 마이클과 메가랩의 그 사전 녹화된 인터뷰 영상을 보셨습니다. 지금 세션은 저희가 민세희 선생님과 곽영기 선생님을 초대했는데요. 민세희 작가님은 데이터 시각화와 머신 러닝을 다루는 미디어 아티스트이십니다. 또한 인공지능 기술의 진입 장벽을 낮추기 위해 공학적 배경 지식 없이도 창작의 인공지능 기술을 활용할 수 있도록 프락시스라는 창작자들을 위한 AI 기반 창작 툴을 개발했으며 현재 경기 콘텐츠 진흥원장으로 재직 중입니다. 곽영미 선생님은 미술평론가이자 연세대학교 커뮤니케이션 대학원 개건 교수입니다. 2015년에 서울시립미술관이 제정한 최초의 국공립 미술관 평론상인 제1의 세마 한합 비평상을 수상했고, 저서로는 2023년에 나온 파도와 차고 세일, 미술관은 무엇을 연결하는가, 초연결 시대 인간, 미디어, 문화 등이 있습니다. 두 분께서 마이클과 대화를 나누시도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 저희 이번 광고했던 것처럼 이번 그 세션 말미에는 여러분이 질문 있으시면 질문을 주시면 같이 대화를 나눠보도록 하겠습니다. 네.
네, 방금 소개받은 곽영민이라고 합니다. 문희 선생님도 지금 막 영어 한글이 왔다 갔다 하시듯이 저도 막 들으면서 저도 가끔 이제 방학마다 그 위 왔다 갔다 하는데 아이들하고 얘기하던 그 상황도 겹치기도 하고, 또 그 마이클주하고도 한 몇 주 전에 같이 얘기 나눌 때도 주로 영어 얘기했었던 게 있어서 필요할 때 시간이 없어서 약간 좀 중요한 지점에서는 잠깐 통역을 잘 해주실 거라고 믿고 영어로 왔다 갔다 하도록 하겠습니다. 제 질문은 세 가지를 좀 요약을 해봤는데요. 좀 굳이 좀 정리를 위해서 요약을 하자면, 하나는 존재론적인 것이고, 하나는 공교롭게 또 이 그 동생분이시죠, 이 법학 교수님이시라고 하시기도 하셔서 법학적인 차원의 문제. 나머지 세 번째 게 넓은 의미의 윤리적인 ethical. ethics라는 표현 자체는 ethos라는 표현이 사실은 도덕적이라기보다는 ways of being이라는, 혹은 ways of being together, 어떻게 같이 하느냐라는 차원의 문제라는 의미에서 세 가지 질문을 드리려고 합니다. 첫 번째 것은 뭐냐면, 좀 전에 맥락에서 본다고 하면 이게 generative art라는 게 말 그대로 생성 미술, 예술이라고 하는데 도대체 얘네가 무엇을 만드느냐? 그러니까 generative what? 그러니까 이런 맥락에서 본다고 하면 이제 많이 언급이 되는 차원에서도 그렇고 이 산호라는 것도 그렇고 다 이 넓은 의미의 artificial한 것과 natural한 것의 경계들에 왔다 갔다 하는 것이죠. 지금 언어의 문제도 얘기를 들었었습니다만 그 되게 재미있는 밈 중에 하나가 그거죠. 생선을 사는데 get by a fish 그런 이제 사람이 물어볼 때 can I have a plastic bag 그러니까 it's already in there. 그 얘기하는 그 생선 안에 이미 마이크로 플라스틱이 다 있으니까 안과 밖이라는 게 되게 모호해지는 상황이라는 게 이제 우리가 살고 있는 general environment라는 거죠. 근데 아트, 예술, 테크놀로지, 미디어에 대한 경계를 얘기할 때 그게 이제 지금 마이클이 하고 있는 문제이기도 하지만 여러 가지 일련의 미디어 필로소퍼, 테크놀로지 관련된 차원의 사람들이 얘기했던 게 경계의 문제이기도 합니다. 맥클루한이건 키틀러건 시몽동이건 이런 사람들에 대한 얘기들을 다 종합할 때 얘기 나오는 것 중에 하나가 맥클루한 같은 경우도 Art is anti-environment이라고 그러니까 여기에 반대한다라기보다 우리가 익숙해 있었던 내추럴하다고 말하는 environment가 이전과 달라졌다라는 걸 포착하는 것이 이제 아트라는 차원의 얘기를 가끔 하는데 그런 맥락에서 첫 번째 질문은 What do you think of the work that you're creating in terms of this binary or distinction between art or natural, artificial and natural? 그러니까 이전의 기존의 개념에 근거했을 때 아트와 혹은 자연스럽다고, natural하다고 말할 때 environment를 당신의 작업이, 마크의 작업이 어떤 차원에서 업데이트하는지 이런 차원에 대한 질문이 첫 번째라고 할 수 있을 것 같고요. 이걸 미리 얘기를 예.
I think that if I'm understanding your question correctly, that I mean it's a great question. The idea of what is generative, I'll talk about first within the art. I think that's addressed very well by the meme you mentioned. I mean, generative maybe only in this case, to me, being kind of a novice to the idea of digital technology being inspiring or whatever, generating a word called generative, right? Generative to me seems to be about not only crossing boundaries, but something unfixed. And the idea of the unfixed also can mean that thing that is unfixed can potentially, in digital space, break things down in a non-material, non-spatial way that we know restriction, right? So maybe it can put that microplastic inside of that fish, aside from a natural process of us ruining the environment and it ending up being in the fish, maybe we can transport it because there aren't the same kinds of porosities and opacities. So maybe when we say generative, the idea of what's generative isn't just about growth in a linear sense. What's generative is potentially what's unfixed. And what's unfixed to me speaks to possibilities for change. And that possibility for change is just a way not only for us to recontextualize what's happening, but maybe for us to generally get together, find space as a community, whether it's online or in person, and then begin to, be, I don't want to say empowered, but find other alternative approaches to enacting what's generative. So the term generative inside of digital space, I think is intriguing to me instead of programming space. It's maybe exclusive to that, the way I would think about it. As far as the idea of the definition or kind of kind of addressing the natural versus art, is that kind of what you're mentioning? The relationship between what's natural and art, as in artificial? Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, artificial art, maybe in a sense can be anything, right? It can be a distillation or it can be a kind of expansion, not necessarily just an expression. It can be any way of addressing and responding, I think, in many ways to what exists. So maybe that's a natural impulse. Maybe that is something, if we tie it to science, that is about curiosity. Maybe it's about searching for identity. Maybe it's very personal and human, that there's an inclination to both express and assert your own existence. That's the existential question, perhaps. And maybe that what is natural is the thing that not only we aspire to, but that holds us back, right? Because what's natural is mortality. What's natural is that we need to keep healthy, that we need to protect an environment that keeps us healthy. So maybe I'm really diverging from your question, but I feel like in many ways, art is a natural, can be considered, or the creative act can be considered a natural response to being in this plane and in society or on this planet, and maybe for locating ourselves or expressing ourselves, and maybe maybe the natural is both context and also a kind of and I don't want to say embattled, but the kind of context that's in question, and maybe that idea of what is natural itself is even a romanticized kind of concept, right?
네. 제 질문이 너무 단순해가지고 부끄러울 수도 있는데, 제가 사실 그 마이클 작업을 이렇게 리뷰를 혼자 못해서 GPT 4.0한테 물어봤어요. 제가 최근에 20불을 내고 플러스 회원이 됐거든요. 그래서 물어봤어요. 근데 so I have two questions. One is 하나는 그 데이터 비주얼라이제이션 퍼스펙티브고요. 또 다른 거 하나는 커뮤니티 퍼스펙티브인데, 이런 되게 그 그러니까 전형적인 질문이긴 하지만 이 데이터 비주얼라이제이션 하다 보면은 이게 형태적으로 인포메이티브하지 못한 경우가 생기거든요. 그러니까 이게 이전에 인터뷰를 보면은 이 트랜지션 비헤이비어라든가 액션 비헤이비어가 임플리멘트 됐다고 하지만은 사실 결과로 놓고 봤을 때 어떤 부분이 어떻게 트랜지션이 일어나는 것에 대해서 리더블하지 않은 게 있어요. 그래서 그런 인포메이션이 리더블하지 않은 거에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지가 첫 번째 질문이고요. 빨리 두 번째 질문하고 넘기려고요. 두 번째 질문은 뭐냐면은 그 커뮤니티를 봤더니 커뮤니티 사이트에 물론 한국인 백그라운드가 있어서 약간 크리스타 킴도 있고 여러 이렇게 다이버시티한 부분들이 있는 것 같은데, 이 커뮤니티가 좀 더 다이버시티하게 갈 수 있고 그다음에 인클루시브한 어떤 포인트들을 생각하고 계시는 게 있는지 궁금해서 질문드립니다.
I mean, great question. Not simple at all.
That's GPT, all right.
Okay. Perhaps extremely complex. As far as data visualization, I think, from looking at your work, I'm very, humbled in terms of the kind of idea of the terms of data visualization, in which I know that your own work directly addresses, I think, the response, and that the data visualization is in its purest sense the expression, right? That the actual form being generated is almost readable. You can almost track back to the data. For me, the idea of data visualization wasn't as significant. Like, it wasn't as much about, and it doesn't continue to be. It may evolve through projects like this as to something that you can understand. What I'm generally interested in, I think, as a sculptor, in my approach of trying to not materialize ideas, but try to integrate the idea that there are kind of rule sets, natural ways things behave. There's for lack of a better term, data, but they can be called conceptual parameters as well for me. Like the idea that there are not restrictive rules, but there are things that I set for myself to say this, how, and all in the service of investigating form, right? Like, why does form exist? And I'm not talking about like a kind of fascistic view that everything subjective is bad, but I'm curious in a kind of contemporary sense, in coming from science, how much order I see. Always saw in everything. There's so much order to form. There's so many patterns. And, rather than being a numerologist or going off into some field where I try to explain that in some other way, I happen to end up in art. And in this pursuit, I think looking for those patterns and forms has a direct correlation with how I look at data, how I look at concepts. And it's not like the forms that I generate require rules or data, but I'm very interested in the idea that why make any form in a place that has so much stuff already, so much material? What, on one hand, in the agenda is the reason for making form, and what, if that form must exist, what generates form? What's behind some of that? So some of that is an investigation, maybe for myself within art about form. Yeah, so I think some of it is like data or an idea or a concept, a set of rules.
그래서 데이터가 어떻게 보면은 스타팅 포인트라던가 폼을 완성하기 위한 어떤 시작 포인트, 재료로서 쓸 수 있는 거라고 생각하시는 건가요?
So data could be, to me, the human, right? The data could be society. The data could be my perception, because there's a point, to me, where data always indicates like, it seems to imply something that's not subjective, but really someone's taking data and deciding which data is important, right? So there's a human part to that. So I always think there's a human part to that, and there is then a kind of response and a form that's generated that's not that it's not human, but that is somewhat influenced by that, right? So there's a little bit of a match back to, your question, maybe that of the natural and unnatural within it, So data isn't for me just a starting point. It's also like an opportunity to interact with history, with society, with how we behave, with my own history, with personal, trying to explain things from the past, whether they're really obtuse or not,
더 깊은 질문은 나중에 따로 하기로 하고. So I have a deeper question, but I will hold it for later. So can you answer for the second question about the inclusive and the more diverse society? I mean the community.
Can you elaborate on that? You mean more in?
Yeah, because when I look at the URL of the ODCR website, the community website, I can see Krista Kim and you have Asian background, so it showed me like a little bit about the diversity people in that culture. But do you have any plan to make it more diverse and get involved more like a small group underrepresented people's voice in there, because it's all written in English, right?
Yeah.
So for example,
yeah.
if you don't really fluent in English, maybe it's hard to get into there.
Yeah, no, that's something. I mean, I remember I'm very new. I was very new a year and a half ago, I guess, when we started to that idea of those communities and Discord servers and online communities. So, one thing I learned quickly was I think that this tech world is largely dominated by a lot of what we call tech bros and things like that too. Anyway, right? It's very male dominated, often white male, but it can extend to any other kind of strangely overly patriarchal kind of system. So what we found within our community quickly was that there were many different languages and different kind of communities. I showed that little demographic map. That was just Asia and Europe and Africa. And that might even be an indicator maybe of kind of more socioeconomic issues too, like who has access to computers, who has access and interest in cryptocurrencies, whatever that might indicate. But aside from that, we did respond or try to respond to the idea of a community. So the community, because in the spirit of the project, we wanted to make sure that, we were always thinking the community and the project would be owned by the community. So in response to that, we try to listen to the community inside of a Discord server. We have moderators that are following, and we're always pretty much 24/7. I mean, it was a really hard lesson how much you have to nurture the baby of a Discord community. And we created at its highest point when we had 80,000 people on the Discord server, when a lot of people thought they were going to make a lot of money out of it, and which was not what the project was about. We actually had about 20 language channels, and so all those language channels were constantly having conversations. I don't know if they're talking about the project or not, but only in their languages. And so that's that doesn't really answer your question. And it doesn't prove that we were interested, but yeah, learning. I think it's learning. I mean, I'd be curious because in your experience, do you think that there's possibility on how would one begin to create more inclusive kind of?
Oh, well, I think the high technology it's really it's a way you can actually make it open to more people because, for example, like a language translation can help you to put more people get involved in this project as well. Yeah, like 20 for now you have 20 different languages, but it could be like a more 2,000 different languages, in the future. That's kind of like a first step getting to making more diverse.
I like that. I mean, I think what it indicates to me as well is what from the little I've been learning about your work that has a biomorphic kind of integration of technology, which is even more, again, back to your question, even perhaps more interesting, maybe for some distressing, for some kind of intriguing, merging of opportunities where translating becomes, and prosthesis like this become more natural, and maybe that is another arena. Maybe even GPT will eventually teach us another language because it's teaching us everything else.
Yeah. Given the time limitation, some of the words that you guys shared caught my attention. 3 of them: mortality, order, and community. They all lead to the last 2 questions that I had. First, mortality sends us back to the question of natural and artificial, because mortality usually belongs to the organic, something that is alive. They have to die. But the works that you're creating is artificial, so they may not die, in a sense. So again, back to the first question, whether or not it is something artificial or natural. And that sends me back to another question of the order, which is when you create these works, they are numbered according to the technology of NFT because they are given 1, 2, or 179, whatever. When we given those numbers, they are differentiated in 2 different orders, which is on the one hand that of cardinal or ordinal, meaning 1, 2, 7, 10. When you do the marathon, when you are the first, you're winning the award, but when you enter, say, 147, you're not given any. But when we create these works in terms of artificial ones, they are treated as something equivalent, meaning their values are equal. Doesn't matter whether it's the first, 174, whatever. So they sent me back to the third question of community, because these works, according to the data that I just read, will be the first ever artwork to be deposited into the museum as NFT works. Again, the question is if these works will belong to only the select few, for instance, in terms of the order of, say, the cardinal or the ordinal number, then the question is, when we usually think of the community as a combination or gathering of the individuals, but rather something from a different perspective, which is that of, say, the way that philosophers like Esposito or Sloterdijk or Wiener-Lecter, they all talk of community in terms of co-immunity. When we have immunity, when we are immune to certain things like virus, like the pandemic, for instance, community is not only a question of gathering of individuals, all individuals on the globe, but of those select few, for instance, which is somehow could be related to the question that people might have when your work, for instance, will belong to some of the museums, for instance, from a certain perspective of the select few. If the immunity of the community, for instance, will be given only the select few, rather than for all people on the globe to share, for instance. So then maybe could be something of a critical balance in that sense. So again, to wrap the whole thing up, whether or not this natural or artificial distinction is still valuable or even valid at all in terms of the work that you're creating, And the second, whether or not the question of the community itself, in the case of, say, NFT-aided works that you're creating, is something beyond the level of what we normally are used to, which is, again, the set of, not only between the individual and the community, but also something more than that, which is, again, the sharing of immunity as such, whether or not it makes sense at all.
I'll try to respond to that without being able to answer anything specifically, perhaps, but I'll respond by noting that a couple of things within the idea of how the project operates, and it could be totally off base, but with your question, but and your observation, but I think that the piece itself exists in a number of forms, and one of the outcomes, as I was talking about outcomes, is this 10,000 part sculpture, and that 10,000 part sculpture is the reef, which is a distinct part of this whole project. That reef is owned by what's called a DAO, and all the commercial rights were passed to that DAO when the piece was sold. So when the whole piece project was done, I no longer have control, neither does Danil. We did find that we had to write a constitution in case it was weaponized, and that piece was used to disseminate political things we didn't like. So we had to create a failsafe, and so we created a constitution that runs that DAO. The DAO also controls a huge amount of cryptocurrency royalties that we gave it to fund other art projects. We also gave it access to the technology we created, and then it became another platform called OG Art. So OG Crystals lost its complete autonomy as an identity. Now it's just part of a collection as a genesis part of a larger program. I'm not involved with that, but one of the platforms that was one of my collaborators is a business. So it's not unfortunate, I just cleave myself off from that. I pursue my end. They have to do what they have to do. But but we're sympathetic in our goals, in some of our general leanings. So anyway, OG, the Reef is owned by a communal voting group that is 6,000, I think, right now. And that group can control the fate of what happens. I want the sculpture to go to a specific museum, and then I want the sculpture to be put into the ocean. And in the ocean, it will become buried by the planet. And so the question of value is more, what do you own? And so that is a long game strategy. The reason we have science to practice is I don't like the idea of putting a lot of plastic in the ocean. So one thing we're developing is viable material studies within this. So it's a long-range practice and project. The community is a community that we have to be in contact with, obviously, to kind of continue. So there's an organic relationship to said community, and everyone in the community has a different incentive for being there. And so not that that answers your question, but I think that there is an aspect of kind of community that is exclusive to ownership and has privileges, but if that project goes to a public institution, does that mean that even though maybe authorship that we talked about earlier in this time together is one that can be somewhat, blurred by involving all the participants, then maybe still the kind of ownership is unquestionable. But once it's in a public institution, if the community agrees to give it to that public institution, not sell it, because I don't want them to sell it to that. There's nothing left in this project that should be monetizable. My community would disagree, but what happens then is, does that then, then we have to start asking questions about the institution, whether the institution itself has a kind of elitism that excludes. But I think the goal of it being in a public institution is one thing that is about sharing it with the greater public. the part about burying it in the ocean again and making the entire physical part of it disappear and be no one's property really, or question that property and question value itself, I think is one of the tenets of the piece. And so maybe in a way that's where I can't answer that question anymore, because it originated from the ahuman and in a sphere that is ahuman, and maybe it ends in a sphere that is ahuman as well. So I'm not sure. Maybe community and the society and people that were a part of it is just a passing phase in its, trajectory. I'm not sure. Maybe that's too cold.
The very last one that I would just want to add to what you just added was, again, what was missing from the question that I had was the peculiar relationship between something proper and property, which we talked about a month ago. When we say something is proper to something, like this voice is mine, or to the nature, but as we know these days, Grimes, ex-partner of Elon Musk, she suggested that my voice can be shared by all of these artists who could come up with new songs, for instance. And she says, let's split the profit of 50-50%. The voice is recognizable as something proper to her, but when it can be generated through the use of all of the different artists with her contribution to it, the question is to whom this voice or the song itself belongs. She, 2 weeks ago on the 12th of June, she opened up through the help of other technology, softwares and so on. She did launch that project with the exclusion of the ownership of the song. They will share the profits, but she can't own the song. The same thing about these works and so on. It is proper to you, or is it proper to the nature? Is it proper to only exclusively to the museum that will buy it? Whose property is it? When the voice itself, even our properties, become literally properties, it becomes a question of buying and selling, even after because we're all gonna die. Artists, after we all die, who will get the ownership? For instance, so send me back to the question of mortality, organic, inorganic, artificial, natural, legal, ethical, so on.
네, 오래 기다리신 것 같아서 저희가 플로어에 혹시 질문이 있으시면 좀 여러분과 이야기를 할 수 있는 시간이 있었으면 좋겠습니다. 혹시 질문이 있으신가요? 네, 선생님 질문이 있으셔서, 네네.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I just have some questions regarding the community. As you said, there's a Discord community of the people who participated in this project, and they're going to decide on the future of this work, whether it's going to go to the museum or not. And I was wondering, like, how the decisions are made, because there's so many people involved. So, like, is it a poll, or how do they make a decision? Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah, we have a voting protocol within the community, but I've seen different waves. It's interesting because to me it's like the community of this project is almost like a sentient being. Even though everyone is there for a different reason and incentive, there's a kind of general narrative that floats through, I think, Discord server communities. And this is new to me. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe I'm off on this. And in the end, I'm completely wrong, because in many ways there are people that are more major stakeholders, as you will. There are people that have more crystals. They get more votes. So I don't know what their machinations are, whether this is going to operate like some kind of weird board and it's ultimately some kind of corporate thing. But what I found within these Discord and NFT communities, as I was kind of talking about, hinting at earlier, is that these cultures get created around these things, like around this campfire I was talking about. one thing I forgot to add to that was that, you know, with real work, the thing that's inimitable is the impact. You know, when you touch something, when you smell something, when you are in front of something, there's an encounter, right? And there's also sometimes an idea or there's a vision, you know, and you have to also deal with that other person, you know, that idea, that concept, that vision, that design. And the two of them together is a lot for someone to take on. It can be overwhelming, and it can be overwhelming in a great way or off-putting in another way, right? Good and bad. We like art, we don't like art. We like clothes, we don't like clothes. There's also, to me, in a digital sense, in that community, there's something that's a little bit gentler, maybe. Maybe that's the wrong, maybe that's too anthropomorphizing, but where there's an imprint. And so there's this all this culture and belief built around an idea first. Whether or not it ever comes to fruition, there's an undeniable community created. So it's almost like if it gets made, it's almost like it was made by need, by request, by demand, rather than it being made and then having the community around it have to contend with it and then all agree. There's already consensus by creation of community. So that said, I think there's a certain strange sentience that if you create a good community around your, in this case, I'm going to just call it an NFT for lack of a better term. If you create a good community, a healthy community that has certain kinds of values you can inject into that community that include some of the values you're talking about, then I think you can get that community to vote the way you want it to. You know, that you can be in discourse and without, in a non-political, I hope, way, begin to shape a dialogue that says, this is the best outcome. But if it's not, there's nothing I can do about it. So, but we do have to answer your question more specifically, there's a voting structure. You have more votes if you have more crystals. Everyone talks and tries to influence each other throughout the community. And, you know, one example is, the best example for me that was really exciting is when we created the DAO, the first thing that the community asked to vote on was extending the lifespan of the growth cycle, right? Because we only planned to run the growth cycle for 2 months because we were running 20 render farms 24 hours a day at great expense, making crystals constantly, right? Reading algorithms and generating these forms. We were like, 2 months is it. We have to stop there. And so we have to stop there at 2 months. So the first thing the community asked for was, can we extend the growth? And they won. You know, they voted 1 more month. So they actually extended and changed our intention, you know, as a project, and also increased our loss and profit, you know, in the whole project and royalties, which is fine. It was actually an interesting kind of concept, you know, to contend with it because it wasn't it was antithetical to a business model, right? And so that was an interesting kind of way that the stakeholders behaved. They behaved against their better interest financially. So.
저희가 시간 관계상 하나 질문을 더 받도록 하겠습니다. 네.
So my question is actually about your community offline. So you briefly mentioned that you are working with a manufacturer here in Seoul. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on your sort of selection process when it came to, and you said that this manufacturer, like what this manufacturer sets apart from other manufacturers that you've met, and what you hope that will bring about from this connection that you're creating in your time in Seoul.
Yeah, you know, I mean, one part is that I'd worked with what I thought was the only process we could work with, which was SLS process. And just in a nutshell, it's a process in which the material is catalyzed out of a powder, right? These are pretty complicated forms. You can see some of the spikes and things are really delicate. So this material is catalyzed by heat and lasers coming and catalyzing powder in various layers, and it builds itself, but there's always gravity to contend with. The powder holds it up, right? So you don't have to worry about any supports. So it's almost like magic. It makes it, and you pull it out and you shake it off. So I thought that was the only process we could do for such delicate forms. But what I learned here is that in Korea, there's a technology and an ability and a work flow and interest in material, probably material responsibility based upon a long history of difficulties with pollution and environmental issues with material. That is very self-policing, but also in the consciousness, I think, of manufacturers. And so in this case, 3D printing is a pretty gnarly thing environmentally, right? This producer he works in SLA, which is a different process. It works in liquid, but because it works in liquid, it needs supports. Otherwise, the whole thing will just fall to the bottom of the pool, right? So it's being catalyzed inside of this liquid bath. It's like Han Solo in Star Wars or something. It's being or Luke Skywalker's arm being repaired. So it's in this bath being built, but it also has this architecture that's holding it up. Here they've perfected a technique and a method for actually eliminating that really quickly, a methodology for it. Maybe it's a labor issue, but not entirely, because I don't think Korean labor is the cheapest labor in the world, but they have a very good workflow. But more importantly, and perhaps germane to the question, and my answer is that it's an incredibly it's photocurable resin, which is the most non-toxic that I have discovered in any process that's been produced right now. And all of the paints and any kind of coloration or colorants we're using are no VOC, zero. So there's a huge kind of emphasis on keeping up with the technology of what's possible and what's available. So as I develop a relationship with them, what I realize is they're changing even their material approach as they go. So by the time it's I'd say maybe a year in to making with them, I'm hopeful that perhaps with these shared mentalities that they've even come up with a better material. So I like the idea that I'm not just going to a company that is just making one thing and that's what they make and they make it out of this material. I think I'm working with a group that is pushing the envelope of trying to keep abreast of what's available and possible in terms of material technology. So I guess we're all in a big experiment together. So at least that's what I hope. And
네, 얘기 나눌 것이 많았는데 저희가 시간 관계상 오늘은 여기에서 중단을 해야 될 것 같습니다. 오늘 참석해주신 오늘 토크해주신 마이클 주 선생님과 패널 선생님께 감사드리고요. 지금 현장에 오신 분들과 온라인에서 조인하시는 모든 관람객분들께 감사 말씀드립니다. 그럼 오늘 수고하셨습니다. 감사합니다.